listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it's time now for another edition, the last edition this week of the most disruptive show in those divided states. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, burning in that darkness, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And going straight into our top headlines this morning. Well, I'll start with this one. Glen Greenwald has resigned from the Intercept. This is due to editors, according to his account of the situation. By the way, a very compelling account of the situation over on Matt Taibbi's Substack. Matt Taibbi, of course, formerly of Rolling Stone and other outlets. Not formerly. Anyway, Glen has resigned from the Intercept, an outlet he co-founded due to editors from the Intercept wanting to prevent him from releasing articles critical of presidential candidate Joe Biden. There's a bunch of, leaks just because it's him bringing the story out there. But there's a great overview of this. Again, if you go check out Glen Greenwald's Substack and Matt Taibbi's Substack, we can maybe get into what Substack itself is in a minute. But anyway, the irony, Greenwald says, I'm going to quote here, is that a media outlet I co-founded and which was built on my name and my accomplishments with the purpose of guaranteeing editorial independence is now censoring me in the most egregious way about the leading presidential candidate a week before the election. End quote. Jamarl, this was shocking when this came out yesterday. What's your take on this?
This is going to be my monologue, but I think you can predict my take on this. I hate this. For me, look, it's one thing if somebody is writing about, saying there's a fire or go kill that person. Fair enough. There are laws against that already. Even if somebody is making this argument about, lying about somebody, saying this person did this or that, well, there are liable laws against that also. Glen Greenwald just wanted to write about something that is potentially true, by the way. And their response to him was basically, well, even if this is true, Donald Trump is worse. That's basically where they were coming from. And they were going to eliminate the areas of what he was talking about having to do, basically it was attacking Biden and they didn't like the fact that it was going after Biden. And it might have impugned Biden from winning the race. And so an organization that he literally started, the Intercept, censors him. Think about that. He started the Intercept, think even the name, Intercept, in order to go after mainstream media and the lazy way in which they push conspiracy theories or the way they avoid certain stories. And what did they do? The organization he started ends up censoring him. Amazing. By the way, he says this is not Brazil. Intercept Brazil does great work. He's saying this is the U.S. version.
To be clear, this is tragic. In a weird way, I think that was one of the first things you said is that how much it frustrated you that this was happening. I feel that in a weird way. I also simultaneously feel the opposite, just in the sense that if this is happening, I'm glad that he resigned. I'm glad that he is now free. I'm glad that he's, off and sort of able to do his thing without that, not corrupting influence is a kind of a cynical way to look at it from his end. Another way to look at it is this organization had some serious problems develop over time, and journalism in general does too. So I kind of like the fact that this is coming out, just because for people who are following him, I think it's good to break away from that mainstream as much as you can. Looking at him as a journalistic figure, he has done great work historically. So the fact that he can sort of, I think, hold people and keep being independent, and ideally set up some new outlet that's better, something like that. This happens occasionally, of course, but anyway, there is, I think, a silver lining to it in that sense. In any event, in other headlines this morning, the United States has seen its sharpest uptick yet in daily cases. That's over 91,000 new cases of COVID-19 posted on Thursday. posted last night. This is in the 24 hours leading up to 8:30 p.m. The U.S. recorded over 91,000. That's 91,295 new COVID-19 cases. This, according to Johns Hopkins University. Jamarl, we were talking about this briefly before the show started. What's your take on this?
I mean, that's disturbing. Honestly, think about that. I mean, and going into an election, no less. Like, I when I woke up this morning, I always check to see what, just news stuff. It's like my Twitter feed is the way I organize my news feeds. And so I could see basically the news stories coming up, like the New York Times, Washington Post, and so forth. And I was shocked. I mean, well, I'm saying shocked, and, put it in perspective. 88,000 new COVID cases, the biggest one-day record of the entire time. And then El Paso shut down all the essential services. Utah is talking about rationing care, where some patients will get care and other patients wouldn't. That's astonishing. You have 9 million cases. It took 14 days from the 8 million to hit 9 million, meaning we gained 1 million cases in 14 days. That's astonishing rate. Like, this is what I mean when I say I don't know how Trump wins under this scenario. I just don't. I could be wrong. I could be totally wrong. And it could go to the Supreme Court. All sorts of stuff could take place. But when you have numbers like this, I mean, you have people like dropping dead like flies. It's unrestrained, right? I mean, this just seems horrible.
Yeah, that's how the rates of growth go. I mean, larger questions for some reason are coming to mind about whether or not we could have ever averted this crisis in full, in toto.
I don't think we could avert it in total. No, like, I don't, like, no, regardless of who was in office,
you just
like
slow the rates of
greatest
slow the
president
rates of growth
ever was going to lose people. I just don't believe they would have lost this many. That's all.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, and the rate of growth does matter. The rate of, how it impacts hospitals. That's, of course, the big real fear here is, as those numbers keep going up on a seasonal basis, potentially if this thing doesn't go away, you just get a point where either you have to have a sort of permanently raised hospital capacity, or an intermittent one, but the capacity for it, which is pretty darn expensive and a big shift from how our medical system, is working right now, and the needs for it. Or, as this thing grows and the hospital beds get overrun, the fear there is that the mortality rate is going to shoot up significantly, just, because it's harder to provide pharmaceuticals to people in their homes. If that's what it needs to cure somebody's sickness, it's hard to get. How do you like mass administer? You get what I'm saying there, Jamarl? Anyway, we do have more headlines to get to. I want to get through them. In an opinion piece on Fox News, Tucker Carlson has suggested the possibility that a flash drive containing information on Hunter Biden, given to Fox News by Biden's former business partner, Tony Bobulinski, was intentionally removed from its packaging and scanned by officials within UPS. The flash drive was removed from its packaging while en route to its destination and, according to UPS, found sitting on the floor before being left on a supervisor's desk, unseen there for more than 24 hours. They're saying that they had already scanned the contents of this flash drive, but again, he's not directly accusing them of anything. He's not accusing them of anything. He's saying they haven't given an explanation for how that happened. But, if you have a flash drive in a closed package and then it's found removed from that package, and, that's the story, and then it's left on somebody's desk for over a day, it's just, what was going on there. Anyway, Jamarl, had you seen this story? This is relatively small, but it fits into the wider Hunter Biden thing. And it is weird and a little bit eerie, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I have to see that one. I mean, I've been following the Hunter Biden stuff, and the laptop stuff, and the items that were in it. My mind got more so onto the censorship of that, if that makes sense. Just because it was so
100%.
Extraordinary. But no, I hadn't heard this one. This was a new one for me.
All right. In Bolivia, Bolivia's outgoing parliament has approved a motion recommending that ex-interim president Janine Áñez and her ministers face justice for responsibility over last year's unrest, which left around 30 people dead. The Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, meeting in a joint session, approved on Thursday a parliamentary report on the, quote, massacres in Sacaba, Yapacani, which recommends a judgment of responsibility against Janine Áñez for genocide and other offenses, end quote. That came according to the Senate's Twitter account. Broadly, Jamarl, my opinion is If there's justice to be served, then, you should serve that. But what worries me, if you're looking at a country, is like these cycles of retributive justice where parties flip-flop back and forth as each one coming into power. They sort of are persecuting the one before. I think part of that is it's usually based on a lot of real stuff. It's not usually like each party's making stuff up. Like there's increasing corruption in the society. But then what you get is this like constant breaking of the sort of, we talk about in a presidency, you want to have a sort of clean handoff of power where there's not this long, drawn-out, contentious thing. It seems like it's a part of that cycle. But, like I said at the beginning, if there's justice to be served, you do
this
it.
one is slightly different because this wasn't like a clean handover. I mean, they literally took the government. Right.
Totally.
It was a coup.
100%. 100%. Yeah.
And there were
totally.
people who were hurt, injured, killed. The woman who's a senator now, who's there in parliament, she was attacked. There's video of her getting her head shaved and stuff dumped on her. No, like, you have to prosecute that, right? I mean, like, for example, when George Bush got out of office, should there have been a trial to determine whether or not the war in Iraq was legitimate or whether or not he led this country into a war? My response is yes. You have to prosecute, right? Otherwise, the person is going to do it again. Like, not prosecuting Bush incentivizes Obama to go into Syria and start all those wars, or incentivizes the next guy to start all those wars. So I understand what you mean, but there has to be some level of a system or state to be able to prosecute elements of the state that behave in untoward ways. That's about
100%. Yeah, I mean, and if you go too far towards the other end of the spectrum, then what you get is, effectively some kind of a crony state where there is never a transfer of power, where there's just one continuous oligarchy sort of constantly pardoning the crimes of its past, if that makes sense. So either one of the, just looking at it from that perspective, it's a simple model, but either one of those extremes is going to be unwise. In our next headline, in New Zealand, they have voted to legalize euthanasia, but they could reject recreational cannabis use following two referendums that were part of this month's general election. That second vote is still out, but in its own way, a big update there. And my last headline this morning, Belarus's President Alexander Lukashenko has named a new interior minister and begun partially restricting entries from Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and Ukraine. He's citing COVID-19 fears. Diplomatic staff are still allowed through, and trucks can still traverse the borders. A spokeswoman for Poland's border guard told Reuters that Belarus was still letting in Belarusian nationals. Closing effectively the borders to the north, the west, and the south, I believe. In any event, we're going to go into headlines here. We're going to go out of headlines here. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And I think I'm going to go into a break very slightly early. So we'll have more time for Jamarl's monologue and a little bit of conversation there. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with Jamarl Thomas giving us his monologue and thoughts this morning. Back with him on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can reach us, or you can hear us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, give us a like and definitely share it. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Call in. Last night, this monologue was going to be entirely different, but it's typical. Things happen over the course of the night, or you wake up and something happens, and it bothers you enough where your monologue changes. This is one of those instances. I've said on more than one occasion that Glen Greenwald is a lion. Now, the reason I've said that is because very strong against the intelligence state, very strong against whistleblowers, and making this very basic, flat fact, strident point that if you are supposedly in charge of your government and you don't know what that government is doing, how are you in charge of the government? Meaning if it's your philosophical responsibility. I mean, after all legitimacy of the government's rule, its ability to kill and maim and injure and make laws and everything else, supposedly comes from the fact that these guys are either voted in, meaning the legitimacy problem is solved by the fact that the public makes a choice. Great. Your government, supposedly, ideally, philosophically, is your responsibility. And if that's true, then how can you take responsibility for your government when much of the budget is black, or when you don't necessarily know what the government is doing, or when all of the stuff is hid behind the scenes, when your government is doing horrible things in South America, in the Middle East, or in Southeast Asia, in your name? Shouldn't you know? Now, the entire point of whistleblowing, the entire point of putting the information out so the public can see is so the public can make a choice and have and deal with the responsibility that they're enshrined with. Media is supposed to be that investigative source. It's supposed to be the thing that helps the public understand and know what that is. But oftentimes, what you get are selective leaks, meaning the media is associated with a particular political party or with a person in that political party, and that person is there where that person could give leaks. You have the other gentleman that used to work at the LA Times, and you found out he was a CIA plant, where he was getting the CIA to air his stories. I'm making the point that this is not entirely uncommon, which is why having somebody like Glen Greenwald was always an asset. The Intercept was initially started with the entire point of intercepting and giving counter to the typical, either let's say spin or the typical hegemonic idea of news, meaning the foreign intelligence state, the way they would have Clapper and Brennan giving advice on CNN, despite the fact that these guys might be implicated in a crime pretty soon. I'm making the point that the Intercept and the point of the Intercept was supposed to do what current journalism is not, to be adversarial. It's the job. Glen Greenwald started that for that specific reason. And now a story that came out in the New York Post, legitimate story, by the way, that Glen Greenwald wanted to cover, the organization to which he started did not want him to do so. And they were going to put people like Reisen as editors on the story. And these are people who are Russophobes. I mean, go back and look at the video between Aaron Maté and James Reisen, where Reisen gets eaten alive in that interview and hangs up early because he doesn't want to deal with the fact that, what he put out wasn't indicative of the reality of things. In fact, even the people getting locked up, I don't know if you remember this, 3 people got popped for the Intercept. You had Reality Winner, she's probably the most notable. You had another gentleman dealing with drones. And if I'm not mistaken, you had somebody who works at our network. Whistleblowers. Now, the wild part, maybe not the person who works at our network, but I'm making the point that 3 people got popped by the Intercept in dodgy ways of handling information and handling whistleblowers. The Intercept has problems. And part of those problems is being on display right now with the person who helped start it having to walk because they're censoring a story that he wants to run. Utterly astonishing. The New York Times piece, or the New York Post piece for the Hunter Biden stuff, is a legit story. The information in it is either true or false. And fact of the matter is, the mainstream media has acted as if they were working on Biden's team trying to block this story. Glenn, who is competent enough to go through and separate wheat from chaff to make the determination about what's true and what's not, they didn't even want that. They got to the point of saying, well, look, Glenn, I mean, even if you could bring up stuff about Biden that was corrupt. It doesn't match up to Trump's corruption, as if this is somehow of a contest. The job of the Intercept is not to protect Joe Biden. The job of CNN and MSNBC is not to protect and block for Joe Biden. And yet, that's what it seems like their job has become. A valid story that comes out the New York Post, and to put it in context, any story that comes out about Trump, and this is not a rah-rah Trump, but any story that comes out about Trump was perfectly fair game. You went for 3 years screaming about the Russians trying to topple democracy with Facebook and Twitter ads. Every story that came out, Trump and Russia, and despite the fact that those things were burned to the ground, now all of a sudden media has such integrity that they can't bear to run a story like this. And Glenn, who is a phenomenal journalist, is now stuck in the position of having to leave an organization he created because that organization finds its worth somehow in some level of association, or at the very least in the protection of the Democratic Party. Whether they realize it or not, the job of media and the job of the Intercept, the job of CNN and MSNBC is not to play defense for Biden. Their job is news. It's not to jump out there as if they're some kind of warriors and they're trying to protect America by protecting America from real information. Because for whatever particular reason, they think in 2016, Hillary Clinton, the actual person that was supposed to win that office, the warm blanket to which they held on to, was somehow denied her office. Glenn is right. And it's sad, but they basically wanted him to get rid of references against Biden. They didn't want that article because that article was, again, against Biden. You think of the relationships that take place behind the scenes between mainstream media and the people who are in politics. It's supposed to be adversarial, and yet these guys are buddy-buddy. They're chummy. You have a situation with talking heads, and all of these guys, for the most part, are millionaires, very well off. And they're giving information to people who overwhelmingly are not. Meaning the world that's being presented and explained to the population itself is being given to them by people who are distant and distinct from the people to which they give information to. Is it possible that the reality to which they give is not necessarily going to be, entirely accurate, or maybe in their best interest and not others? Biden, they love. Biden is the status quo they want to get back to. And so in this very specific case, when information comes up, even in organizations like this, even in organizations that were set up specifically with the entire intent to be adversarial, hold political leaders accountable, hold media accountable, even that institution falls apart. Astonishing. When elections are at stake, and you have people who, regardless of what they call themselves, meaning that guy says he's a journalist, that guy says he's a reporter, that guy says he's something else. At the end of the day, in the reality of things, they're just people. And those people have political distinctions just like every other person has a political distinction and political ideology. And regardless of what they say, that ideology peeps up, rears its head in this very specific election, where for them, Joe Biden is a savior and Donald Trump is the thing that's going to end the world. That is not their jobs, however. Their job is to do news and to be accurate and honest about it. Glen Greenwald stuck to that. Intercept did not. Shane, when I do this show, I have a sign up there. I always tell people, be the integrity. Try to be honest. Try to be straightforward. Try to give your opinion. People know where I'm coming from. I'm a lefty. And I don't mean that from the standpoint of a Democrat or anything like that. I just mean when I get up in the morning, I want people to have health care. When I go to bed at night, I want people to be able to go to school without, I want public services or vital services to be held within the context of public sphere, whether that's a public owning it itself, maybe not necessarily a government-run service, but a public-run service, or whether it's worker co-op. I'm less picky on how that stuff gets done. I'm more particular on the fact that it should get done. When I hear Glenn and stuff like that, my thought is, good, we need to know what our government is doing. And people like Glenn are there to make that point. And it's not about getting a Democrat elected. It's not the job of reporters to get a Democrat elected. And the moment that they come to that conclusion, they've screwed up somewhere. And yet, that seems to be where they've come to. I'm honest with my position. I tell you, I'm a lefty. You know where I'm coming from. But by the same token, people who watch this channel are Trump supporters. People who watch the channel, follow the political spectrum because they know at the very least I'm going to be honest with them, whether I agree or disagree with it, and I'm going to give them the truth of it, regardless of my political position. That's not happening from the standpoint of mainstream media, and it's clearly not happening in the way that Glenn would literally have to step down from a company that he started because they didn't want to run a story critical of Biden. And whether that's Twitter doing this for the New York Post, whether that's Facebook, all of these guys seem to be running defense for Biden to get him in office. What do you think about it, Shane?
I think that this is revelatory. So, I mean, I think that Glenn Greenwald is he's still kind of on the fringe. A lot of people don't know who he is. We know who he is, but we're kind of within some sort of larger, wider bubble. But he is very well known. He's still very prominent. I would say a majority of Americans are familiar with his work, but heck, man, a lot of people just are out of it. I guess where I'm going with this is if he can break people away from the sort of mainstream, if you have eyes to see, what you're seeing here effectively is a good journalist dealing with the institutional inertia that you can, safely bet is pervasive across pretty much every mainstream media outlet. I mean, this is how editorialization works when it's heavy-handed, and usually it tends to be in either more perverse or just dumb ways. But you can see this. You can see this happening, and again, I feel like this could represent a sort of puncture to that balloon. And ideally, we get people away from watching primarily mainstream media and back into watching primarily alternative media. I'm going to come back to a Substack. Actually, this is what Glenn is moving into as his one of his prominent publishing platforms. It's also, again, you can find Matt Taibbi writing about this. Taibbi from the Rolling Stone,
another
also
great
over
journalist,
on
by
Substack.
the way. Matt is awesome.
Yeah, totally. And what's significant about that, the fact that they're moving to this specific site, it's not anything about that site itself. It's what it is in general, which is a sort of subscription service thing that lets people subscribe to and pay journalists independently. And I think part of why this might be a potentially successful puncture in that mainstream media bubble, the establishment bubble thing, is that if other journalists who are kind of afraid but still have some scruples about everything that's going on, if they see Greenwald moving there and basically doing okay, they're not in the same position. Most folks aren't as successful as him, so it's not a complete comfort. But just getting the idea in their head that they could, build up to it, build up their
subscription
their journalistic.
It's not easy, man.
Yeah, subscription base,
It's
and
not
they're
easy.
that's not just the audience, but all that stuff.
It's free.
Having the hope of that, I think. Do you see what I'm saying?
But it's
That kind of
uncomfortable.
can drive people out.
Yeah, but that's uncomfortable. And I'm just saying it from experience. I agree with you, so don't misunderstand me. But it's like you're working somewhere. You have a check that's coming. You know a check is coming, so your needs are met.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, do I get rid of the paycheck? This is why I always say the profit motive thing. It's a leash. It's a chain. The people. It's almost impossible to be free or to be even yourself under the model where somebody is paying you. Like, for example, Matt Taibbi makes the point that says this is just the microcosm of what has been taking place in other newsrooms. He says, in the last few weeks, I've heard multiple well-known journalists going through struggles in their newsrooms with pressures to avoid certain themes when campaign coverage, often central to their worries. There are many reporters out there, most of them quite personally hostile to Donald Trump, who are grating under what they perceive as a relentless pressure to publish favorable material to the Democratic Party's cause. Glen Greenwald's stories mirror others, but it's more striking. Meaning, this is what is taking place across multiple newsrooms, not just with Glenn. Glenn is just an overt case of it.
This is the default. This is honestly the default of how things work. Well, the only reason that this is particularly striking is that it's gotten, worse qualitatively over recent years. But the heavy editorialization, suppressing certain stories, that's just pervasive in newsrooms. And it can be as heavy-handed as this. And it's not like there's a need even for a larger conspiracy theory to suppress the story, although that does happen in a lot of cases. But it's also just that when it's not already being covered, and you have your biases, you just lean against doing it. And so, of course, what you get is polarization of information, which increases cultural polarization too. But we've got to go into a break. Interesting conversation to get into, though, potentially. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute speaking with Maram Sousli. Back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series,
No Maram yet.
Deadliest Epidemics in Human History, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We're going to be joined shortly with Maram Sousli, but there's something else I wanted to get back to for a moment. You know, Seymour Hersh, I don't know if you know who Seymour Hersh is. Seymour Hersh is an amazing reporter. He looks like a newsman. Like, if you...
Cy.
Yeah. He looks like a classic newsman. I don't know if people can see a newsman in their head, but if you could think of, a picture in the dictionary, Seymour Hersh is the guy. Seymour Hersh made the point that he said once before that the chemical weapons that were being launched in Syria were coming from Turkey. Now, he made the point that Obama knew about this, which is the reason why Obama chose to didn't launch. Now, Hersh had all sorts of pressure put on him about this, and I forget how what he came to this. He was something about information behind the scenes. But Hersh is also one of those great investigative reporters that does amazing work. He was the guy with the My Lai massacre, and he was also the guy who made the point of talking about internal pressure in newsrooms. Meaning, at a certain point, there are times where your editor or the person who's reviewing the story doesn't want that story. And at a certain point, there's an internal pressure where the person knows, okay, I'm not going to keep putting stories like this, or this is not an area I'm going to go. This is not an angle I'm going to touch. And Taibbi mentions the same thing, meaning it's not a situation where these guys are free radicals of sorts. When it runs up against the grain of what either that publication or what, let's say, the elites of that particular publication and the connections that they have, there is pressure on the various journalists to behave and act and to write certain things. And it's not so much that they say, hey, go write this. It doesn't have to be that way. It's more so that they know that the comments that they continuously get back. Like Taibbi, even in the statement about Greenwald makes that point, saying that when an editor keeps questioning or when an editor has like these ideas and opinions and in-house stuff, that it gets across to the person who's writing it that this is not something that they necessarily want. And that if they're giving you certain assignments, they're telling you that certain points of views are allowed and others aren't. It's shocking, honestly. Like, I couldn't imagine starting, the Progressive Soapbox as a channel, and then after 2 or 3 years, you bring other people in, and then they tell you that you can't do a story that you want to do on your own channel. Can you imagine that?
Yeah. Well, because here's the thing: another way to look at this is that he co-founded it, and so from the beginning you have a sort of diffusion of control.
Yeah, it's not.
And at a certain point, the organization builds up, and you're a personality there, and you're one of a number of people, but it's not just his outlet, and it never was. Although he is, in my opinion, brought pretty much everything to the table.
Yeah.
When it comes to journalistic chops.
He mentioned that too.
That doesn't mean that the institution isn't going to change.
Yeah.
I mean, this is maybe just where my mind goes, and it's partly like a sort of a schadenfreude at seeing just another corrupt journalistic institution fail. And so I kind of like that in my own way. And it's also, if this is happening, it's good for him to be free of that. But there's also this thing where, again,
that's a tough
where
one.
I keep coming back. Where I keep coming back to is, I just hope that other people, I hope that this works for him. Hope it works well. And then what we need, if you're going to have viable journalism outside of these larger bureaucratic institutions, where the individual sort of free radicals who are at the frontiers of actual work, the actual journalistic work, who are doing good stuff, I feel like there are enough niches. In a recent off-show meeting, I remember we were talking about this idea of the long tail. As far as I know, like 1,000 True Fans, this essay specifically by this guy named Kevin Kelly, who's a co-founder of Wired magazine and Technophile and all this other stuff, an author. And he's making the point that with the internet, you have you no longer have a media monoculture, where you no longer have a sort of media ecosystem where, because of the requirement for really upfront, big capital investments, like with a TV station or a radio station or a printing press, et cetera, because you don't need that, what you allow for with the internet is a bunch of people to very cheaply get started and start releasing content. That's obvious if you look at it, Things have changed a bit with social media, but there's also this push away from it. And, even if you use social media as a bridge, you can still have your own platform on the internet. Anyway, what you get with that is, instead of having lowest common denominator programming, so to speak, you get this mass diversity. And with that comes the ability to potentially support, not a huge success, but to keep going a wide variety of different, sort of niches, different fits to cultural interests. Now, with journalism, this is particularly important because if you can make it as an independent journalist in that ecosystem, if you're doing good work on some frontier, I feel like you will be able to support yourself with this. I think that this dramatically helps that. Now, you compare that to the former situation, the sort of status quo default, which is you have to get a job with a big outlet, and then inevitably, if that outlet's not great, they're going to keep you from doing your work. You see what I'm saying, Jamarl? Hopefully that's what people get from this.
That's what I want. I mean, that's what, like I said, I really hope Glen does well, because Glen is astonishing. I didn't want the Intercept to go bust because it did great work. Like the drone bombing or the drone papers, the Jeremy Scahill, those amazing documents, like that Jeremy Scahill was able to get. Even, the Julian Assange stuff. I mean, the Intercept dropped the ball on all of that. Like, they became Russiagators at a certain point. So, so I feel you on that. And yeah, I hope Glen does well. If there was a universal basic income, people could whittle away on a channel, not making a huge amount, but making enough to live. So I agree with you on that, Shane. The internet does allow a certain degree of freedom. But right now, we're joined by Maram Suzli, a political commentator, geopolitical analyst, and chemist. I love that last part. That's so random. How's it going, Maram? Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. I started life out as a nerdy chemist and just happened to fall into politics as well.
That's awesome. So let me ask you this. For right now, there's an article that just came out, and apparently the U.S. had seized a tanker, of an Iranian tanker, and they sold the oil from the thing to which they stole. That is astonishing. I mean, basically, the United States is still trying to, I guess, inhibit the back and forth between Iran and Venezuela and slapping sanctions on companies associated with the two. What is the goal of this? The gentleman that we had on yesterday made the point that the United States offered Syria at one point a deal. And basically, Syria turned them down because they're not going to make any deals with the United States until after the election. They're not going to give Donald Trump a win. Do you know anything about the, I guess you could say, the back channel negotiation between the United States and Syria in order to get the hostages released?
Yeah, I do, in fact, know quite a bit about it. obviously, I don't know about the internal dialogue that's happening, but I know about the surrounding circumstances. But first, the Iranian tanker, that is a big escalation, stopping, it's basically an act of piracy to stop a boat from selling its oil to another country. And the thing that everyone has to remember is this is illegal, because the sanctions on Venezuela are not UN Security Council sanctions. These countries are not under UN sanctions. So basically, the U.S. what it's doing is an act of piracy. And they've kind of tried to do the same thing when Iran was supplying oil to Syria. The idea here is the same goes for Venezuela, goes for Syria, is to try to starve out these countries to submission and to giving the United States what it wants. In Syria's case, they want to legitimize their occupation. They want to make it permanent. Now, like in Iraq, here's the thing. What the U.S. wants to do in Syria is achieve exactly what it did in Iraq, whether Assad is there or not. So what did they achieve in Iraq? They got rid of, they made sure that Saddam didn't have any chemical weapons, which they already knew that he didn't. They destroyed the country. They created a sectarian violence, terrorism, and most importantly, they created a Kurdistan where they could have permanent U.S. military bases and cut off the rest of Iraq from its oil resources, because a lot of the oil is in the Kurdish areas. And even though a small number of people live there compared to the rest of Iraq, or Baghdad, for example, is in the south, and Basra, essentially it's to make these countries weak forever and subservient to the United States. Because, of course, Iraq is still under U.S. occupation, and their government is under U.S. control. So they want the same thing in Syria. Obviously, they didn't achieve that. They didn't get rid of Assad. Right? They couldn't get rid of Assad like they did with Saddam. They couldn't kill him like they did with Gaddafi. So now they want to try to get the same thing with negotiations. And I think that the Austin ties thing is an excuse. I think what they want is Assad basically the sanctions are there. The U.S. is occupying Syria's oil fields, and they're going to try to tell Assad that he should write a new constitution that federalizes the country and creates a Kurdish region which the U.S. can permanently occupy, and the Syria can get some of the crumbs thrown down at them from that, and maybe a little bit of a lifting of sanctions. But of course, they'll also want Syria to give up on its war with Israel, which of course Syria cannot do because Israel occupies Syrian territory, and at the same time, Zionism is always looking to expand. So it's an existential threat. And part of that is they want to alienate Syria from Iran. So all of those things are probably what the U.S. wants. And what Syria has is supposedly they have Austin ties, but it's not true, because the last time Austin ties was seen was, the last thing that he said was he was going to go meet with Al-Qaeda. And then the last thing that we saw of him was he was in a video with Al-Qaeda. So supposedly the U.S. is there to ask the Syrian government to negotiate for Austin ties, but maybe they don't even have Austin ties. So then what are they there to talk about? Maybe something else. The other thing is with Austin ties, he wasn't just there meeting Al-Qaeda. He was also training the insurgents on how to use RPG. That's something that even his friend Michael Wise said he was doing. And he was, and then he previously had military training. He was in the military. There wasn't, let's face facts, this guy wasn't just a journalist. And he put his life in his own hands, going there and hanging out with Al-Qaeda. Jabhat al-Nusra specifically, he said he was meeting. So it's not really the Syrian government's responsibility what happens to these people in that scenario. There's nothing much that they can do.
Maram, let's do this. Let's take a break, and we're going to come back. This is Maram Suzali, political commentator, geopolitical analyst, and chemist. You guys are listening to Fault Lines on Thomas with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
we actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from...
Calling back Maram on Skype.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are opening our phone lines for your calls if you'd like to speak with us or Jamarl. The phone number is 202-521-1320. And for those listening, Maram Sousli is a political commentator and geopolitical analyst. And by the way, you can follow her on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl. Find her on YouTube by searching for Syrian Girl Partisan and support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Syrian Girl. Maram, thanks for being with us. Appreciate you joining us. I want to turn. It was a good overview you just gave, starting with the conversation about the United States sort of arbitrarily seizing oil and going over the sanctions we've put into place, sort of long-term drawn-out economic warfare. A lot of this stuff, I think, goes back to the second half of the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton's State Department. That sort of set a lot of this stuff in place. Although a lot of it, is it has roots in older presidencies and obviously wider conflicts too. Anyway, I actually wanted to sort of pivot and move to something else in this segment. This is something I've seen you talking about, and I don't know much about the recent news on this. You're talking about connections between Epstein, Rupert Murdoch from Fox, the Mossad. These are the ones that are already known. But then Kevin Rudd, the Australian Prime Minister, that's the one that, as far as I can tell, is at least in terms of its wider publicity, a little bit newer. Can you tell us what's going on there?
Well, we know that Epstein has his tentacles almost everywhere. He apparently funded an institution for peace, which was one of the... Basically, it was an institution that was created to write the Oslo Accord and to make sure that Israel gets a good deal out of it. That's the point of that institution. And that's the reason why Epstein funded it. And what you guys need to know about Epstein is Ehud. Basically, Epstein was a Mossad agent. Ghislaine Maxwell was his handler. She's also Mossad. She basically, her dad was also Mossad, and that's well known, in fact. And they are in Ehud Barak's camp. So they're actually against Netanyahu. And I think part of the reason why the whole Epstein blackmail ring was exposed is because Netanyahu wanted to defeat Ehud Barak at the election. And it's a battle between the basically people who still want the two-state solution because they think a one-state solution will eventually destroy the concept of a Jewish state. Because Netanyahu's one-state solution, in his mind, is to commit genocide against all Palestinians and to occupy the entire West Bank and Gaza Strip.
Well, and Maram, I want to come back to you. I just want to throw this in too. I believe I forget exactly when it was, around 6-7 months ago, maybe more like 9 at this point. With Ehud Barak, photos were released by Netanyahu's camp showing like Ehud Barak entering Epstein's house. So that, for one thing, that is an opposition attack by Netanyahu against Barak. But it also, like you're saying, it does show connections there. He was going to their place. He had a tie there. Anyway, Maram, you were speaking.
I mean, the thing is that these people were doing what they were doing for decades, and the police were unable to do anything about it. So that goes to show you that something must have changed, and now Netanyahu is more powerful than ever. And I think that he wanted to get rid of Ehud Barak's ring of influence, and of course, he was doing that by blackmailing politicians all over the world with the Epstein thing. So when it comes to Kevin Rudd, you guys got to understand here in Australia, it's completely controlled by the Zionist lobby. And Kevin Rudd was kicked out of office in a coup by the Zionist lobby, because he did something that no other Australian Prime Minister did. He went to the United Nations and he complained about Israel because they were stealing Australian passports, the Mossad was, and using it to assassinate Palestinians in Dubai, which would basically make any Australian holding an Australian passport like under suspicion, because like they were basically stealing passports and using them to kill people. So he did what was the patriotic thing, and he wrote a book. This is all public information, saying that the Zionist lobby threatened him to get rid of him and install Julia Gillard, which was the prime minister that came after him. And that's exactly what happened. And the first thing that Julia Gillard did as prime minister was visit Israel. So Kevin is kind of like, he's not great, but he's better than the last tens of prime ministers that we've had, since coup after coup has happened. But he recently did something huge. He started an anti-Murdoch media campaign, because the Murdoch media has an entire monopoly over Australian media, and he wanted to actually open, like stop the monopoly and open the door to others. So he started a petition, basically. And suddenly, we're hearing about his connections to Epstein. So obviously, Rupert Murdoch's doing it to tarnish his reputation. Like, the thing is, all of these people are terrible people. Like, we should have no illusions about it. But some of them are more terrible than others. And certainly, Rupert Murdoch is the terrible one. So in this case, in spite of the fact that, like, the institute that Kevin Rudd works for was funded by Epstein, doesn't mean that Kevin Rudd was like raping teenage girls. That's not what it means. It means the institute that he's in is funded by Epstein. That's all it means. Doesn't mean, okay, you can tarnish his reputation with that, but at the end of the day, Rupert Murdoch's the bad guy, not Kevin Rudd.
That's shocking. I was just looking up the Israeli passport thing. I mean, apparently stealing passports from New Zealand. And yeah, using those passports for hits, that's astonishing. I knew nothing about that. That's amazing. That is utterly amazing.
I mean, these people Israel is basically ISIS that's been legitimized. Like, the whole thing started as a bunch of terrorist organizations. So it's not a shock that they still act like a terrorist organization, even towards their own allies, because they can't have allies because they're terrorists. But the thing is that, sorry, I know that's outlandish to say, but it comes to the point where we just have to call a spade a spade. And the thing is that the sad thing is the person that revealed this passport stealing thing was a Jewish Australian that was also working with Israeli intelligence. So it was like a Israeli Australian guy, and he obviously had retained some patriotism to Australia because he told them what was happening with the passports, and he ended up getting killed in Israeli prison. Wow. He was executed, basically. They claim that he hung himself. But in fact,
before we leave, we have about 5-6 minutes. I wanted to make a pivot to another topic that you brought up a little bit earlier, Kurdistan. The United States, the things that are taking place in the Middle East right now are utterly fascinating. You have Turkey trying to expand in regards to its weight in the region, taking up more space and antagonizing its neighbors, and even some people who are not its neighbors, put it that way. But yep. The issue of Kurdistan is fascinating to me. Basically, the Kurds want to set up their own little area inside of Syria. Or let's say inside Syria, Turkey / Syria, Turkey. Turkey considers these guys terrorists, and Syria, and that's the interesting part. Like you said, the U.S. wants a little area where the U.S. can create Kurdistan and they can pretty much have a permanent military base there. But I thought that when Donald Trump started to pull out and started to focus on stealing the oil and burning the crops, that he basically left the Kurds to their own devices and that they ran for assistance from Assad. What's the latest on this?
Aha. Okay, so essentially, Turkey is a part of NATO. Just a little bit of an extra thing. The region that the Kurds control is actually not majority Kurdish, majority Arab. So, everything east of the Euphrates, they control Raqqa, for example. Raqqa was the heart of ISIS. And when I say Arab, I mean Bedouin Arabs, proper Arabs. So, they can't control the region forever. They can't. Without the U.S. occupation there, they basically wouldn't be able to keep control. The thing that Trump faced was an ultimatum by Erdogan that he's going to go in and he's going to attack the YPG, which is an offshoot of the PKK, which even the U.S. has designated a terrorist organization. Because they're sold to people as Kurdish nationalists, but they're actually anarcho-Marxists. So for the U.S., they labeled them a terrorist organization, and Turkey as well. So Erdogan said, "I'm going to go in no matter what." So Trump had two choices. He could keep the American soldiers there in the northern region and essentially have them caught in the crossfire, or he could pull them back. And he was going to pull them out completely, if you recall. That was his intention. But then, what was his name? Not McCain, the guy that has a very light voice.
You know about Bolton or Pompeo?
Yeah. Not Pompeo, not Bolton. He's actually a Democrat, but he has a very, very girlish voice. I'm sorry, I forget. But one of these guys, they actually convinced him. This guy was very good friends with McCain, if you remember. Not Joe Lieberman. I forget. He has a girly name as well.
You say he has a girly name? I want to say Lindsey Graham, but Lindsey Graham is a Republican.
Lindsey Graham, that's the one.
Yeah.
Sorry. That's the one. A girly voice. So Lindsey Graham convinced them to keep some troops in the oil field in the south because Turkey is going to occupy the north. So he's basically, that's the last stand, is to try to use Syrian oil as a negotiating tool. That is why the U.S. stayed there. And the problem is that while Trump may have given up, Trump said himself he doesn't care about, but he doesn't think the Kurds are angels. Because the thing is that they were training Antifa, and Antifa was going over to Syria to fight and come back to the United States. And Trump wants to label Antifa a terrorist organization as well. So he doesn't have any love for the Kurds, but the neocons around him want to make sure that there's a Kurdistan, and they want to make sure that there are permanent U.S. presence in Syria, which the Syrian people will never accept.
And just so we're clear, though,
in the unlikely circumstances that Assad does, Syrians won't.
And just so we're clear, the entire point of the Kurdistan thing, the U.S. policy on this is for U.S. interests. It's just to have a force in the region that is an ally of the United States that basically is in between those countries, or a permanent force in that particular part of the world. And
the thing is, the problem is that a lot of Kurds from Turkey have come into Syria to create a state. So they're Turkish Kurds, they're not Syrian Kurds. They basically occupied Syria. They came in during the war, and they come in with a chip on their shoulder of the experience of oppression under Turkey. But Syria never had a history of oppressing Kurds. They gave them refuge. So there's no backstory behind the plight of Kurds in Syria. There's never been a plight.
Maram, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. You always give us really good information about this part of the world, and I always appreciate your
At least you get one view. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Maram.
Hearing our side of it.
So the voice that you were listening to, Maram Sousley, political commentator, geopolitical analyst, and of course a chemist. You can follow Maram on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl. You can find her on YouTube by searching Syrian Girl Partisan, and support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Syrian Girl. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with headlines in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And that means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to some headlines. In the news, Glen Greenwald has resigned from the Intercept. A lion has fallen. Glen resigned due to editors of the Intercept wanting to prevent him from releasing articles critical to presidential candidate Joe Biden. The irony, quote unquote, Glen says, is that the media outlet I co-founded, which was built on my name and my accomplishments with the purpose of guaranteeing editorial independence, is now censoring me in the most egregious way about leading presidential candidate a week before the election. He's right. I mean, we talked about this before, Shane. I mean, this is astonishing. Glen Greenwald was one of the co-founders of the Intercept, and it was built explicitly for him to be able to, or for journalists, meaning anybody, up-and-comers, to be adversarial towards the government and towards other media that have a tendency to fall in line with some kind of, hegemonic idea. When Tulsi Gabbard went on Jake Tapper, CNN, I never forget this, and she says, Jake, we're paying terrorists, we're supporting terrorists, Jake, we're giving terrorists money and supplies. And Jake Tapper, we're not doing that. Now, does Jake Tapper know? And Jake Tapper said the government says it's not doing that. Well, yeah, Jake, but the government lies. Do you know or do you not know? That's kind of my point. It's not for mainstream media to do that. New York Times will report about the billions of dollars that we spent in Syria to destabilize the country, but they would do so after Obama's out of office. The entire point of the Intercept was to be that paper. And at this point, they're not. What do you think, Shane?
No, they're not. As somebody said with Greenwald gone, who's going to read that rag? And it's true. I don't know the answer, but this is probably going to gut them in the long run. I guess the only way that they can, this is just an aside, but the only way they can technically survive as an institution is either they find somebody else to sort of hang on to, or they just try to extend the runway as long as possible and, maybe pivot and hope that they keep some sort of new audience. Anyway, Greenwald is good for doing this. And again, the only thing I want to really hammer in here, it's just maybe my take, but I think it would be really good for people to look at this as a model of an independent journalist being independent and, standing up for his ethics. And hopefully we can get more of that. That's what's going to save or at least improve journalism. So, journalism, as Lee Stranahan came on when he was the last on, it's always had problems. And it's not like there was ever there have been golden eras of, journalism in some cases, but usually what those look like are long-term successful campaigns sort of waged either intentionally or just luckily by a few very successful people. It's not that there are, as far as I can tell, periods where journalism has ever been healthy. There have always been problems. There's always been suppression of news stories. And in a sense, with the shift technologically of the playing field in terms of how you can support yourself and whether you can do a fully independent outlet, hopefully we're pretty quickly getting to the point where there might be for the first time some actual genuine golden age, something approaching it at least. But, I think a lot of that weighs in the balance of the election, the next coming elections, how social media evolves and the company's policies change and are restricted. Interesting conversation. Anyway, Jamarl, back to you.
It's like basically, yeah, you're free as long as you don't do anything we don't particularly like. That's kind of the way media is getting at this point. As long as you don't say something we don't particularly like, you can report whatever you want. One last point on this. They like to point to the discrediting of the media, where they say, oh, these other people who are lying are hurting media. It's not the lying. People have lied throughout history. You should look at some of the other presidential campaigns and the things that they used to say about people putting them on little pamphlets. No, the discrediting of the media happened because of the media. The Gulf of Tonkin, the Afghan War, and the lies that have been associated with that we found out from the Washington Post, the Iraq War, and the lead up to that, and the way that the media was, again, hegemonic point of view on this, where everybody pretty much ran in lockstep. They got rid of Donahue when Donahue had a different perspective. They even put Jesse Ventura on ice in order to shut him up because they didn't want him coming out against the war. The chemical weapons stuff that apparently didn't happen, the OPCW leaks that they wouldn't even, but no, the discrediting of media happened because of media itself, not because of people lying. I mean, that's, they like to blame this on other edifices. Oh, it's the Alex Joneses of the world. It's not Alex Jones. Alex Jones is always Alex Jones. The issue becomes if media and people find itself to be untrue or doesn't necessarily report things that are earnest, like the New York Post story, then people come to the conclusion that they're being lied to. And somebody like maybe a Jones that give you 5% of the truth, and they're like, hey, maybe this is true, starts getting allegiance in people's attention. So, they like to put this stuff on everybody else as opposed to dealing with the institution itself that's problematic. And yeah, I agree with you, Shane. Glen Greenwald walking is probably the best thing. It's the most ethical thing to do. Even though it's, not difficult. It's just not easy. The United States is hitting a new high in the rate of daily new cases, over 91,000 new cases of COVID-19 posted every day. In 24 hours leading up to 8:30 on Thursday night, the United States recorded 91,295 new COVID-19 cases. This, according to Johns Hopkins University. A county judge in El Paso, Texas, has implemented a 2-week shutdown of all non-essential services beginning at midnight on Thursday night. The decision comes with a surge of COVID cases that overwhelming local hospitals, businesses including tattoo parlors, hair salons, nail salons, gyms, and massage businesses must close as part of Judge Ricardo Samanego's order. All election activities are considered essential and won't be impacted. Today marked the start of a nationwide 4-week government-imposed lockdown in France, a fight to fight resurging coronavirus. French citizens were confined to their homes as of Friday for the second time in 7 months under the presidential decree ratified by Congress. There's also apparently a nationwide mask ban in Russia. I mean, this is apparently happening all across the United States. I made the point that in 14 days, we've added 1 million cases to the COVID count. And you think to yourself, what is that going to look like in another 14 days? Women's rights organizations are preparing for what they say will be the largest protest so far in over a week of national mass street demonstrations in Poland, triggered by a court ruling banning abortions of congenital damaged fetuses. The march is planned for Friday evening in Warsaw, the capital, in defiance of the government appeals that the people stay home due to skyrocketing COVID infections. The National Public Prosecutor has vowed to file criminal charges against organizers of the protests for, quote, causing an epidemiological threat, unquote, a charge that could carry a prison sentence of up to 8 years. Education Minister Czarnek also threatened to cut off funds to universities that have supported the protests. Some canceled classes during a nationwide strike on Wednesday. Czarnek said the university presidents, quote, who encourages their students and academic teachers to take part in demonstrations contributes to an increasing risk of the COVID pandemic, unquote. The past week of social upheaval follows a ruling last week that by the Constitutional Court, which ruled that abortion in cases of severe fetal deformities is unconstitutional. The protests included people disrupting mass and spray painting slogans on churches last Sunday, actions that offended even the Poles who disagree with the court ruling. In an opinion piece, Tucker Carlson has suggested the possibility that the flash drive containing information on Hunter Biden given to Fox News by Biden's former business partner, Tony Bobulinski, was intentionally removed from its packaging and scanned by the officials within UPS. The flash drive was removed from its packaging while en route to its destination and, according to UPS, found sitting on the floor before being left on a supervisor's desk unseen for more than 24 hours. How weird is that? Shane, I don't know much about this one. So he's arguing that a flash drive by Bobulinski. Now, Bobulinski was the gentleman that came out and basically said that he was working with Biden, and that Biden saying that he hadn't talked to his son about business dealings and everything else was a lie. And he said he was there for it. And you can find it on Facebook. He gives an entire speech. He seems credible. But he's saying it was intentionally removed from its package and scanned by officials at UPS. Why does he think
UPS
this?
is saying that. UPS is saying that's no, pardon me. UPS is saying that basically the guy found it. A worker at UPS found it on the floor somewhere and then put it on his supervisor's desk where it was like not acknowledged or processed for more than 24 hours. And this was, I believe, Monday that this happened, and then he got a response on Wednesday or something like this. You can go through and do more research on this, or pardon me, you can look into that if you're interested in it. But I just saw this not too long before we went on air. But yeah, he wrote this in an opinion piece. And again, he's not directly accusing them of this, as far as I can tell. He is saying that this is one possibility, but it is weird, if it was in its package and it would have had to be removed for some reason.
Get that. So Bob Alinsky sent something, and then it didn't arrive.
And they scanned it. They did get a copy of it. What they were trying to do was basically send it for verification for processing. So they scanned it on their end, then they sent the physical copy of the drive to another party. They tried to, at least.
And it didn't show up. It basically was sitting on UPS's desk as opposed to actually being mailed.
Exactly.
How weird is that? How weird is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to check that one out. That's
it is weird.
That's bizarre.
Yeah.
Bolivia's ongoing parliament approved a motion recommending that ex-term president Janine Arnaz, the woman that was not elected to a pass shop and yet was able to take power in Bolivia after the coup, and her ministers face justice for responsibility over last year's unrest, which left around 30 people dead. The Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, meeting in joint sessions, approved on Thursday a parliamentary report on the massacres of Seneca, Sakab, Yapanki, which recommends a judgment of responsibility against Janine Arnaz for genocide and other offenses, according to the Senate Twitter account. New Zealand has voted to legalize euthanasia but can reject recreational cannabis due to two referendums that were part of this month's general election. How bizarre. How bizarre. Yes, you're free to kill yourself, but no, pot is too far. Shane, it's
a weird one, isn't it?
That's a weird one. That's a weird one. That's a weird one. Look, I'm all for euthanasia.
It's definitely a downer.
I do think people should be able to take their own life. I mean, that's their life, right? I don't want it. So, I don't know if you've watched True Blood. There's a scene in True Blood that has always bothered me to nobody's business. Let's go through the headlines first and see if we have time. Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko has named a new interior minister and begun partially restricting entries from Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and Ukraine, citing COVID-19 fears. Diplomatic staff are still allowed through and trucks can still traverse the borders. A spokesperson or spokeswoman for Poland's border guard told Reuters that Belarus was still letting in Belarusian nationals. NBA legend Sean Kemp is opening a pot dispensary in Seattle today, becoming one of the few black-owned cannabis stores in the city. In a press statement, Kemp spoke about his store and how he wants the cannabis industry, which has been mostly dominated by white owners, to open up a little bit to everybody. Kemp, who played for the Seattle Supersonics from 1989 to 1997, is known for high-flying dunks and for leading his team to the NBA Finals against Jordan. The six-time NBA star now wants to reach new heights in the marijuana retail sector as partially owned by Sean Kemp's cannabis. Reach new heights. Ba-bum-bum. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fall Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good for him. I really do want more blacks to be in the pot industry. And my feeling is you have all of these people who are selling pot, all of these people who Joe Biden was putting in cages, and now it's illegal. And it's legal in most states, or at the very least recreational or medical. And so you still have some people being put in cages and other people who can, get a pot patch if they want a THC patch. I want African Americans to be part of this business and not just working at the stores, especially since many of them were put in prison because of it. But one thing real quick. The True Blood, Bill Compton gets a virus. He gets a disease. The disease weakens vampires, and it makes them, like weak. It kills them to a certain degree. Bill Compton gets so weak, he's lived for hundreds of years. Sookie, in love with him. And you get to the point where he's like, kill me, Sookie. And she does it. Now, there's a cure for it. He doesn't take the cure. And I'm like, what are you doing? He's ill. He's not in his right mind. Save his life. I don't care. But she kills him. Bill Compton was my favorite character, and Bill Compton died. It hurts. I'm going to leave that here. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are now taking calls. The phone number there is 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, as we were going out, you were talking about euthanasia, Bill Compton, and Sookie Stackhouse. I watched parts of True Blood, but I'll be honest, man, you plus spoiled. You ruined it for me. Granted, it's been years since I watched this, so it's not like I'm in that loop anymore.
I used to love that show.
It was an interesting show. Now that I have some distance from it, I do want to respond to the euthanasia thing. But I just want to comment. What a weird name, Sookie Stackhouse.
I love that.
Sookie Stackhouse. It's a good name.
It's an awesome name.
Not really.
I used to love that show. And it's like the first episode with Bill, and he's sitting in there, and just all of this gravity just oozing off of him. And Sookie is looking at him. She can't read his mind, and she's immediately infatuated. And it's like, love. That's love. And my wife jokes me when I say that, but I'm like, he loves her to the point where he'd kill everybody in that town in order to save her life. And it's like, is that really love, or is that something else? Like, is that infatuation, or what is that? That's love. That's love in this kind of grand, overt, explicit terms. No, I don't want to do it, but I love you enough where I'll do it to save your life. I love that show. Love that show. But but my point is, at the very end, he gets really ill. There's a cure. And he doesn't take it. And he tells her...
Oh, man, you just remind... Oh, man.
Yeah. And the song,
the only thing is that every time you do that, Jamarl, you know what you're doing. You're plot spoiling, bro. There's so many people. I mean, granted,
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to plot spoil. That True Blood has been out for years. It's been out for years.
No, that's the thing. It's super. No, I get it. I get it. That's one of those borderline cases. Okay, so here's the thing. We are taking calls, and there's only so long to talk about True Blood. 202-521-1320. Real quick, though, with the euthanasia thing. I mean, it's like, along with the death penalty, I personally disagree with the death penalty. I guess with euthanasia, it's just, in both cases, you are giving the government the power to kill its own citizenry. You're sort of not the government directly, it's doctors, but you're saying, okay, you're putting these laws in place. There's not even a slippery slope argument. I guess it's just a weird feeling as somebody who, doesn't have to decide like a monarch whether or not this is legal or not, without weighing it out, just on a first appraisal. It seems like that's potentially dangerous. And I'm not, that is a slippery slope argument. You can see that as a fallacy, whatever. But having said that, specifically, I mean, I oppose the death penalty. And with euthanasia, if you want to kill yourself, there are a lot of ways you can just kill yourself. It would be safer and more reliable, certainly, if you were to go to a doctor. But it's also something you can currently just do by definition. Anyway, that's probably a rather crude opinion, Jamarl. Before we go to Tarif, what's your take?
Oh.
I don't want people to off themselves.
Wait,
I'm here. I don't want people to off themselves, just to off themselves. So don't misunderstand me. And even, when bringing up Bill, it was to kind of make that point that Bill was ill, and Bill had a cure. Bill didn't take it. This was not a case where he should have offed himself. That's my point. There have been cases where people get very ill, and those people don't want to deal with it, going forward. I mean, if you have Alzheimer's, if you have some other degenerative disease that is going to screw with you where you can't walk, can't clean yourself, and those type of things, I can totally see why a person wouldn't want to be here. I mean, and I'm speaking from somebody who was ill, deathly so, and, never got to that point of thinking, okay, I don't want to be here, but definitely could see from where I was, from how a person could get there. Like, I knew when I first started, when I first got sick, one of the first people that I ran into was a woman who was blind, missing legs, had diabetes, and was on dialysis, screaming at the height of her lungs because she didn't want to be there, and yet these people were forcibly sticking her. Like, what do you do with that? Does she want to be here? And if she says at some point, no, I don't want to be here, do you refuse her of that? Like, I understand the slippery slope argument. I don't want doctors just offing people, and I don't want that to be a doctor choice. I'm talking about an individual that says, I don't want to be here, but doesn't have the capacity to do anything themselves. Like what's the guy named? Dr. Kevorkian, for example. They put him in prison.
Yeah, he was a big one.
Yeah, he was a big one.
In Oregon.
Yeah, so it's not, I don't want this to be done willy-nilly. That's not what I'm saying. But I don't want it to be illegal either. And maybe it's nuance in that, and I don't know what the nuance is. Maybe you just can't make a law about that. Like you said, if a person wants to off themselves, they off themselves. But I don't know. I don't have a huge issue with people deciding, especially in cases of medical stuff, that they don't want to be here. I can understand where they're coming from. But like I said, whatever color. But like I said, I'm not hard on this. This is not a hill I'm willing to die on. I'm less, more flexible on this one.
I hear you. Yeah. Anyway, let's go to Tarif. Tarif, you're on the line, calling in from New Orleans. What's going on, man?
I have 3 comments before I talk about the 3 comments. As we progress in society, we have technology breakthroughs that will help people out with the ailments. Just keep on moving forward and also chip in. You never know. You could be an inventor. Okay. I'm glad you got your.
Wait, Tarif, you always give good. I can't say always give good advice, but you often give good advice. My doctor said that one day. I was 19 years old. There was an intervention because let's say there were issues, and always obstinate, especially when pressure is being put on me. And he's basically he says, look, if you believe that your life at 19 is not going to get any better, that nothing is going to change, then fair enough. You can stop all this stuff, and I'll let you get end of life treatment. However, I'm telling you, 19 is not the position where you can be making that choice. Now, how am I supposed to answer that, right? Like, because as a flat fact, there's no way for me to know if things are going to get better from 19, and most likely at some point they are. So it's that. So good suggestion. I like that. I remember that suggestion going all the way back to I was like 19 years old. So.
Okay. I'm going to get to my 3 comments. I'm glad you got Yvette Carnell on. She should at least apply for a job now, see if she get a spot open, because I know you got spots open. My second comment. Somebody from the African government was trying to get in contact with Trump, I think. I was listening to LaRouche last night, and it was talking about you got starvation about to happen in Africa, with tens of millions of people could die next year. And the person was asking for military personnel and also the American farmers to work together, and they can just ship and fly over their food aid. And then probably can make some deals with some diamonds and minerals. Something that's above board without no regime change or anything like that, My third comment is dealing with the jobs program. Once the students finish this jobs program, Trump or whoever got to implement a infrastructure program. We got 5,800 cities like Flint, Michigan, New Orleans need new sewage lines, new water pumps, the parks need to be renovated with bathrooms. Need to install pines. In the West Coast, like what Shane was talking about weeks ago, it need to be it need to have intercoastal canals going through Utah and Idaho, giving water to the trees there so they won't dry up so quickly and create these massive fires. You can take that water runoff coming from the Alaskan slope dealing with the glaciers melting every summer. And you can transfer that clean water down to the Midwest. And what's going to happen is that's going to free up more area for people to move to and help out, the farmers as well. And that'll solve a lot of problems. That's all I can think of right now. So that's it.
Thanks, Tarif.
Tarif, thank you for the call. Yeah, interesting conversation there. I'm going to come back on that third point particularly. By the way, just looking forward to having Yvette Carnell on the show later today. Should be an interesting conversation about ADOS. Anyway, coming back to that later. With your third point there, I think that an infrastructure plan would be great. I think I'll put it like this: if Trump or some imaginary candidate this election cycle or in 4 years, and I'm just saying Trump because I do not see Biden pushing for this. I bet who knows? I don't know. Just put it out there. If you had a larger infrastructure plan like that, if that were coming along with a sort of comprehensive reform plan to improve America structurally, materially, that could be part of a jobs program, recovering from the COVID crisis. And you could use that to try to do sort of R&D and in some sense push America forward in ways. So instead of just rebuilding bridges, for instance, or repaving roads with the same old pavement that we use, there are ways in which you could tie in renewable energy. That might be part of it. But moreover, just doing interesting, new, sort of experimental, but still, verifiable or whatever, like widespread improvements. If there were something exciting about it, and it were putting a bunch of people back to work, and if it were stimulating industries that you'd want to stimulate, if you wanted to have like high-tech manufacturing and a return of high-paying, sort of durable jobs going forward, building a material future, that sounds really exciting to me. I think that as part of like a wider plan to not just build up America's productive material economy, but also restore, try to repair a lot of deeper problems. Like if you had a unification of that, major jobs program, major infrastructure program, major sort of R&D future leading program, along with a lot of reforms and improvements and intensifications of some aspects of what the government is doing for people, and to try to do reparative justice and, lead towards long-term economic equality. If you had I'm being vague there just because there's a lot to have in that conversation, but if you do that, that's actual leadership. You could have a president coming out and pushing for that on a wide basis and really vigorously getting it, like FDR style, FDR level programs. If that were to happen, I could see us turning the wave within a couple of years to really good effect. Jamarl, do you have any take on that? What's your opinion?
FDR, Kennedy, I'm going to the moon. Build a huge thing. There's no point to life. There's no, rhyme or reason to it. You basically make your point, and we kind of lurch to and fro as a society without any kind of objective or anything. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. Your society could have an objective. In the same way that Kennedy said we're going to the moon, he had no idea how to go to the moon, but over the course of 10 years, they developed the technology, the acumen, and honestly, the society itself, even if you remember, organized around it. People were talking about the Jetson future, that we're going to be in space and have these little cars. I'm going to have my flying car and Hyperloop and all this stuff. You have the technical acumen to do those things. And if your countries came out and says, you know what, we're going to build a Hyperloop from here to there, or we're going to build this stuff on the moon and go to Mars, you could do those things. And the moment that your country organizes its energy and productive capability to do those things, oh my God. Like imagine the kids in school saying, I want to be a part of this. Or the people saying, I want to be a part of this. Or you're working part of a project that you know is a grand scale project, that you know is going to have something going into the future that you're going to leave for your kids, and that expands your abilities in material sciences and technology and all those things. Those things are possible. We have the skills and acumen to do those things. We just choose not to. So yeah, Shane, 1,000% agree with you, man. I think this is the part where we fundamentally agree. More than anything else, that this stuff is possible, and the fact that it's possible, we can do it.
Real quick, I think you need to do this at the same time as you have that same politician working with their own established group, their own established, ideally something like a new political party, And if they're doing that at the same time as they're trying to generally improve the efficiency of government, sort of root out corruption, that might seem like you're taking too much on. You might have to do it in quick succession or something if you want to have an effect within a term, potentially a single term. That seems like the most viable route in the U.S. to make that happen. Because I'm just stressing that because you need to do that while you prevent those programs from becoming bloated, from becoming, corrupt and subject to the pressures of either private industries or current political interests, non-demographically representative political interests. Anyway, we're going into a break. We're coming back on the other side of this break talking about economics with Steve Grumbine, political, economic, and social justice activist and a founder of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. We'll be back with him in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and our guest for this segment and the next, Steve Grumbine. He is a political, economic, and social justice activist and founder of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. That's a 501c3 and 501c4, respectively, dedicated to education and advocacy for modern monetary theory. Steve, thank you for being with us. How are you doing this morning?
Steve, is there anybody out there?
I am. Can you hear me? How are you, sir? Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. I appreciate
you for being with us. Yeah. All right. Let's get into it. Interesting introduction there. Steve, thank you for being with us. Talking about Biden's economic/austerity plan. That's your insertion there. I'll leave it to you. What is the deal with his plan here? What would this bode for Americans, and how specifically in light of the pandemic, how well do you think this is going to serve the people if he gets elected?
I've got some really mixed feelings here. I am, this is Steve, myself as just a human being, not speaking on behalf of any organization. I don't like Joe Biden. I don't like the way he thinks. I don't like his history. I don't like his policy space, etc. However, that said, I do know a lot of the people that are trying desperately to work their way into the administration, and their goals are not to be friendly with Biden so much as it is to infiltrate as progressives and make their mark, even in an environment where they don't feel like they have a great opportunity to make an impact. So I want to say, I see Ellen Omar come out and say that she really does believe Biden's going to bank left and all this stuff. I have no evidence whatsoever. In fact, all the evidence to the contrary. My thoughts are, if you go by 47 years of Biden history is very clear. It's austerity. It's reducing spending. It's putting people in debt, private debt, etc. I believe that there has been some cultural change in the United States. I believe the pandemic itself has fundamentally changed the way a lot of people think in terms of government benefits, government spending, etc. So, all indications are that Joe Biden has rejected the socialist label, rejected the social spending label. And yet at the same time, people that I know and, respect seem to believe that there's a chance this old codger is going to try and make a name for himself and be remembered for something other than having spending. So, you know what? It really is a bit of a crapshoot right now. I hate to say it.
Biden hasn't offered anything. I mean, I guess I look at this and say, could they influence Obama? Could they influence Bill Clinton?
No.
Right? So, this has been 40-something years. And they're just coming up with a new argument to try to get people to bite. I mean, for example, AOC, Ilhan, all of these people part of the squad and everything else. Do you honestly believe that they would ever tell you to not vote for any random Democrat that's elected? I mean, is there any Democrat? If Joe Manchin became the presidential contender, would AOC come out and say, don't vote for Joe Manchin?
No, AOC would play the party line for sure, and and you see this consistently. I mean, Ilhan Omar had kind of withheld her support at first for Biden, and literally was one of the few that had kind of held out. And you see, she's kind of been brought in, to heel, so to speak, as they say, and I think that overall that, unfortunately, this is what you see. You see Democrats literally defend Democrats. Democrats literally, no matter what, they could be eating babies.
Right. But that's kind of my point, Steve. If under this model, Joe Biden has a 47-year record. Everybody knows who Joe Biden is. And Joe Biden has spent his time bringing in Republicans onto the DNC stage, some of which took swipes at AOC. They spent the entire primary doing everything they can to stop Sanders, even going so far as to say we're willing to lose it to Trump if it means stopping Sanders, meaning all of them were willing to rip it from Sanders' hands at the convention if necessary. I mean, call it sexist, racist, bigoted. Elizabeth Warren say you're uniquely violent. I mean, these are the things that the party pretty much identified and associated with Sanders. And then for his supporters, to the tune of 70 or 80% to turn around and back the party. This is after getting 88% of the party to back Medicare for all. I guess my point is, if you win the policy argument across the board, and you win the policy argument even to the tune of 70-something% of people saying they wanted to expand Social Security or elimination of student debt or Medicare for all, you get massive numbers in the party, and they still tell you to kick rocks. What I'm asking is how? Where is the leverage? Where is the pressure that lefties are saying they're going to have in a Biden administration if they can't even push him during the election? Meaning, if you can't push Biden with 88% support for Medicare for all, and he still say, I'd veto it. If you can't push him for that, you can't push him for anything. That's my point.
I don't disagree with you. I'm usually, and I am, my personal affect is firebrand, the hell with Biden. That's where I stand. However, playing a little bit of devil's advocate, one of the things that I see happening is that the youth of today are not the same as the youth of yesterday. These people are politically aware. They are not willing to take an old white guy just telling them stupid stuff. And quite frankly, Joe Biden, as soon as he had an opportunity to show that he heard what was going on with Black Lives Matter, for example, first thing he says about the police shooting here in Philadelphia. Very first thing he says is, hey, there's never a good time for looting or rioting. Military death SOB, right? And so you think to yourself, there's no way he's going to listen to progressives on fiscal policy. There's no way he's going to listen to progressives on bold programmatic changes. And he's even said nothing will fundamentally change. So I think the answer. I don't believe that anything's going to change. In fact, I think it's only going to get worse, quite frankly. I think that they're going to, quote unquote, fix what Trump destroyed, try to reduce the deficit. Once they start reducing the deficit, that's going to pinch the little people. It's going to hurt the very people that are claiming that this whole thing is going to help. And then simultaneously, the vote blues and all their downstream adherents are going to start gaslighting and bashing anyone that dares say anything against the reduction of the deficit. I think this is wash, rinse, repeat. There's no question about it. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of an insight because, quite frankly, you look at the stinky center, right? The stinky center of this country is neither Republican or Democrat. They're just very comfortable and they want to stay that way.
Right.
You kind of see them swing between the two parties. So the question becomes, let's say a hypothetical Sanders would have won this thing. Are we talking about watching the center Democrats, the center-right Democrats swinging over to support Trump just to avoid the quote-unquote socialists? It's a very real possibility. I really don't think that there's any kind of forward motion here. I really do believe this is a dead end. I believe Biden is merely a placeholder, and I'd be really interested in looking at Kamala Harris and thinking about what her history with criminal reform, justice reform, and what her stances are on Wall Street and so forth. And I think you'll have a better understanding of where things are going by looking at that guy. I think Biden's just merely treading water until Harris takes the reins.
Steve, we're actually we were just talking about infrastructure. On the other side of this break, we had a caller, Tarif, call in and talk about infrastructure. Biden has a $1.2 trillion land infrastructure plan, but I want to get your take. We could talk about his, we could talk about yours too. How important do you think that is? Looking at it from an economic perspective, do you think that's sort of one of the like top, like say it's a top three, something like this, one of the most important economic considerations in terms of a large addition to the budget over a longer term period? And then specifically, I'm curious, this isn't necessarily your area, but he's talking about a 10-year plan. I'm thinking if you can intensify it, if you can do it within a couple of years, that's especially on the other side of this crisis. If you shorten the time span and sort of raise expectations, and then you're able to follow through, and that's of course the big if, then you're potentially able to do a lot and really add a fill-up, really add a quick boost to not just the economy, but our productive and research capacities. Anyway, more there. But Steve, what's your take?
So you're absolutely right. Let me tell you, I believe infrastructure is one of the top, like super top priorities. Number one, infrastructure is usually something that garners bipartisan support similar to the military. I mean, with better plus side, right? Our electric grid in this country is dilapidated. Our dams, levees, you name it, all of our infrastructure is just absolutely horrible. Our bridges, our roadways, many of the bridges are derated. These things need significant upgrades. And so if you're just looking at simply getting them out of that D category, with the structural ratings and so forth, and bringing them up to a modern A or B or whatever, that alone is such a huge economic push. It eradicates almost all the fibbery about automation, because now all of a sudden you see millions of blue-collar jobs supporting that infrastructure build. And yes, to crash that, to shrink that time frame, to do a really, really solid insertion into the economy, that would be a huge boom for all of us. So what I'm hoping to see is something like that. I would like to see significantly more than 1.2 trillion. I'm thinking somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 trillion. Just look at, I don't have this data in front of me, but I know in Pennsylvania alone, most of the bridges here are in rough shape. There's many, many bridges that are in very, very bad shape. And the monies that the federal government encumbers to get the states to do that work, that could be severely increased. That would immediately give a big boost to state governments who are very, very tightly constrained by their tax revenues. So the idea of having that kind of an direct insertion into the economy at the state level as well, not just the federal highway systems, but go ahead and earmark some sort of act-type money for every state, like block grants to do this work, but with an earmark for specific targeted infrastructure upgrades, I think would be a tremendous boon for the entire nation. And not only does it facilitate commerce, which is pretty obvious, it improves the lives of everyday Americans, but it also provides millions of good-paying jobs for people that are inclined to do blue-collar work. I think it's one of the great opportunities we have right now to really kind of change the trajectory of this nation. A lot of our infrastructure was built in World War II, or right after World War II. So a lot of stuff is way past its born-on date. I think it would be very, very instructive to consider that not only does building infrastructure bring great money, but so does maintenance of that. When you go ahead and earmark significant funds to maintain these structural improvements so that they maintain their rating and they don't just go down to a D, and then all of a sudden we have to find stimulus to pay for it. I think that is a great way of keeping the economy really going in a very positive direction as well.
I could absolutely see that, Steve. We're going to go into a break here, but it's a fascinating conversation to have. I mean, two very brief additions here. You could potentially do this while you're sort of rehabilitating the institutions responsible for maintaining our infrastructure. I mean, similar to how, if you're making a big change, it might make sense not to fire everybody, but to just reorganize and slightly change the structure in ways that are actually constructive in the long run, while hiring new people, building the organizations up, and giving it a sort of institutional reinvigoration, reincarnation even. And then just very briefly, and this is another side of it, if you do this at the same time as you invest in R&D for not just, repairing what's already there, but actually dramatically improving it, whether it's, high-speed rail, I talk about the Hyperloop occasionally, ideas like that. It's sort of on the frontier of what's possible, but also still relatively economically reasonable. And then, one last brief third thing here, also potentially very useful as a way to sort of stress test and in the process reform some of your key political institutions while you're going through this. If you have whoever's doing this would need to be a strong leader, and if they really take advantage of that, this could be a model for how to improve the government. And hopefully they're doing that in other areas at the same time. But we'll see. In any event, we've got to go into a break. We're joined by our guest, Steve Grumbine. We'll be back with him in just a minute talking economics. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan. Joining us today, one of great friends of the show, Steve Grumbine, political, economic, and social justice activist, founder of Real Progressives and Real Progressives in Action, and a 501c3 and 501c4, respectively, dedicated to education and advocacy for modern monetary theory. Steve, again, thank you for coming on to the show. So yesterday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, Dow dropped like 900 points, just plummeted. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, all of this is basically related to the COVID issue, either from the standpoint of the lockdowns or from the standpoint of recognizing that demand is not there. By the same token, we have this weird scenario where all of these people lost their jobs while the stock market was still ticking up. How do you explain the discrepancy between these two, Steve? I was told that the stock market is the real economy. And so if the stock market is going up, everybody should be doing fine. And yet all of these people are out of work. I mean, right now, I think it was 793,000 that sought for unemployment this time around. So how would you, if you had the opportunity to kind of redesign this, meaning to push us forward, if you could whisper in the ear of the next president in regards to how do we ensure that the people who don't have a job get a job, and the people who are doing monstrously well don't take 95% of the income gains again? How do you reorganize the economy to ensure that that takes place?
Well, the very first thing I do right off the bat is institute a federal job guarantee. I don't even think twice about it. It's the greatest program out there possible. What it does is it immediately, sets the bar, sets the base. There is no dropping below this because these private sector entities cannot hire you without having to compete with this job guarantee. So it immediately raises the bottom, big time raises the bottom.
But raise the bottom, you mean wages. You mean wages and benefits.
Wages, benefits, the whole enchilada.
Because a private company would have to compete with government at that point. Meaning, if I'm offering this guy $15 an hour, he's never going to take a job for $5 or for $10.
That's exactly. Now, the good news is that if you think about this, all that money that's being spent on those job guaranteed jobs is new money, right? Every bit of that is new money. So if you think about it in those terms, what you've got is a situation where you've got a net infusion, you've got people working in their local communities, you've got great environmental impacts, because what do you have when you have people working in the local community? You have less traffic on the roads, you have less pollution. You also have greater job satisfaction, life satisfaction. You've got other moral, hazard relief, if you will, in terms of families suddenly no longer having the stigma of unemployment. There's just so much benefit here. The ability to get people job training, be able to help them find careers of their liking.
Even the multiplication effect of tax base, meaning the revenue that comes back from those people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, that's going to impact the local. You got federal monies coming in, which are not tax dependent, going into local communities that are highly dependent on those taxes. So you've immediately staved off. When you look at all the states, I would love to see someone do a report on this, and maybe we'll do it at some point. But I would love to see the health of each state, to see kind of where they are financially, to see which one of them have a plan that isn't dependent on borrowing more bonds and leveraging more public services that have to be auctioned off when they go bankrupt. I'd like to really, really see the state of states. And I think that a federal job guarantee immediately, this should be a Republican hallelujah, and it should be a Democrat savior. This right here is a independent man's, best friend, if you ask me. So this is the bottom end, right? We gotta work on the bottom. But then on the top side, you definitely need to alter the way we tax things. Now, I'm going to speak on my own belief system here, and I believe that what they call land value tax is a tremendously great way of attacking rentier-type rent-seeking behaviors that really, really exacerbate the wealth inequality in America. So I think that a land value tax, as opposed to an income tax and a consumption tax and so forth, is a really, really good way of trying to eliminate a lot of the inequality-making rentier-type behaviors. But then we also have to do some trust busting. We have to do some monopoly busting again. We have to get out of allowing the Jeff Bezos of the world to just sort of own the world. And we used to know that. We did it to Ma Bell. Judge Green broke up the Bell system. Now you've seen them reconstitute as a result of deregulation under the Clinton era. So there's a lot of things that have happened that I think that we could reverse. I think regulatory reform. We could also, one of the other important things, and I don't think we talk enough about this, is eradicating corruption. Right now, I spoke to Bill Black, who is one of the premier leaders in routing out, financial corruption. And Bill Black basically broke down the ratio of actual federal auditors that actually go after these industries to validate what they're doing. Like when the housing crisis hit, that brought the whole world down in the first global financial crisis. That right there, that would not have happened had we had enough regulators in there that literally looked at this stuff. So there's a lot of corruption that can be done, routed out. There is the job guarantee that can lift the bottom. Obviously, I believe in a robust Green New Deal. I've seen some motion that there's still energy, there's still life coming to that. They're still pushing that, which is great. Maybe too little too late, though, if you're talking about efficacy on the environment. But talking purely economics, these are all great opportunities to eliminate wealth inequality, make sure that we have some rules at the top for how we spend this money, to make sure that certain percentages must go to people, not just the CEOs or whatever. There should be some sort of stipulation that monies that are tax monies that are credits or whatever that are given to companies cannot be used just for stock buybacks. They have to be used for some productive value, something to that effect. I think there's an awful lot of ways that we can do that. I don't know that we have the political will to do that, but that would be my dream. That would be my desire.
I think political will, in some cases, there's both ends. You have the public and then you have leadership. I think leadership is a big component that we've been lacking, definitely. And if, with the sort of breakdown in recreation, potentially of either the DNC or the RNC or both, just looking at it almost statistically in the long run in terms of the historical cycle of things, if you have a successful reform of one of those parties or the creation of another competing party that edges out that duopoly in some way, then you might have a space for leadership that would give the political will. You're giving a interesting overview of a bunch of different stuff there, most of which I agree with. Some things I could see implemented in different ways. And so you talk about a federal jobs guarantee, for instance, unless you have the corruption, which you did, bring up as one of these key things you can do, unless you have a way to route that corruption out of the system. I'm just worried about building up these sort of stagnant bureaucracy things. But that's a concern that obviously doesn't dominate. It's just a concern that I think you have to take into account when you're looking at the possibility of a large state-run program. Although, frankly, of course, it happens with corporate statism too. Where you have corporations who get regulatory capture of the state and then use that power to keep themselves in place as a monopoly. Steve, we've only got a couple minutes left. A bunch of stuff to respond to there. Love these conversations. I want to turn to the market, actually, specifically in light of the virus. It feels like Dow has been dropping over recent days, so that's definitely a shock to it. But it feels like, other than that, things have been oddly pacific in the stock market waters, considering the fact that we've gone through a serious economic contraction, apparently, the likes of which we haven't seen in potentially 80 some odd years, if not longer, 80, 90 years, if not longer than that at this point. Maybe never. Maybe this is unprecedented. What can we actually read from the stock market in our last 2 minutes, Steve? What's your take?
Well, I think we've realized that our economy is largely financialized. We're talking about an economy that doesn't produce, that simply bets and trades. It's a casino economy. And so Wall Street, the people that are invested in, they're enjoying their games of chutes and ladders, and the rest of us living the real economy are really struggling. That money that's in those stocks and bonds and markets and derivatives and all that stuff. This is what the economy's become. It's living off of debt servicing. It's living off of a whole bunch of non-productive things. Now, I know that there's some people that would try to say that is part of the real economy, but I just don't. Most of it is. It's not like people are using that money to go out and buy TVs. I mean, that money is living in another stratosphere, rarely making it down to Jane and Joe public. So I think that what you see though is a debt servicing world, a world of debt that is allowing these speculators and investors to see giant gains in the market. Plus, the way the federal government has used its power of the purse has been to give these kinds of institutions money. So they're not losing anything. There's no real risk. It's kind of like people's money. And the only people that have money to do that are people that already have money. So this is a huge deal to me. I'm sure others, that we have to somehow or another get into that fire sector and do some significant reform in there. Last time we had any meaningful stuff, I don't think of Dodd-Frank and stuff like that as anything meaningful. I mean, Glass-Steagall, I think we do need a modern day Glass-Steagall. I think we need a lot of that type of regulatory reform that goes into the corruption for sure. And the LV, things like that really attack the rent-seeking behaviors. But that whole space that you're talking about there, Shane, is really just largely financialization of debt. I mean, you're not seeing anything.
That's what I feared. Steve, we're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us. For those listening, that was Steve Grumbine, political, economic, and social justice activist dedicated to education and advocacy for modern monetary theory. Follow him on Twitter at SD Grumbine. We'll be back with him in a minute with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time for our last hour this week of the most disruptive show, covering news and events in those states. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get back into the headlines this morning. Glen Greenwald has resigned from the Intercept due to editors from the Intercept wanting to prevent him from releasing articles critical of presidential candidate Joe Biden. Glen Greenwald, notable journalist, inveterate journalist who has for decades at this point worked to uncover specifically corruption and malfeasance by intelligence officials and the intelligence community more broadly, working with WikiLeaks historically, just doing good work in general. And a quote here from Greenwald: "The irony is that a media outlet I co-founded and which was built on my name and my accomplishments with the purpose of guaranteeing editorial independence is now censoring me in the most egregious way about the leading presidential candidate a week before the election," quote, end quote. And he's right. There is this widespread political bias that we see in the country. We were talking earlier about how it's kind of good to see this story coming out in a sense. At least that's my take. If it's happening, obviously that's bad. But the fact is, it is happening. It's pervasive throughout the industry. It's rare that you have an institution that isn't in the long term co-opted by the sort of gradual peer pressure, the gradual thermodynamics of, and in some cases, very intentional dynamics of suppressing certain stories for the political interests of certain actors. Even if it's not like you're getting a paycheck or it's not like you're getting phone calls at night from higher ups, even if it's not that, it is just this sense of, if nobody else is covering it, or if the people that I sort of fit in with aren't covering it as a class, well, then should I cover it? And it's that fear. It's a human thing. But the hope, of course, is that in the journalistic profession, in that institution, you have people who'd be brave enough to rise above that fear. And that is sadly, constantly, cynically revealed to almost constantly not be the case. Anyway, Jamarl, I've been rambling for a bit about this. I know you have some feelings and thoughts too. What's your take?
No, you're fine. I mean, you're right, of course. I mean, you started an institution off with the idea of a mission statement, and it's like, what is the point of this mission or this institution? And he told you, the job of the Intercept was to do adversarial journalism and to adversarial from the standpoint of other media outlets and other politicians. And for the most part, they did that. The stories that they were breaking, unfortunately, the leaks were being prosecuted, meaning information that were given to the Intercept mishandled it in some cases, like in the case of Reality Winner, where they basically exposed her and she ends up getting prosecuted. The other gentleman, they got prosecuted for giving information about the drone killings. Like, they were screwing up and people were going to jail for their own malfeasance. And, he makes the point, Glen Greenwald makes the point, like, they use me as a cover for that stuff, even though I didn't really have anything to do with that stuff. And so, yeah, the organization was becoming problematic. And then, like you said, you would hope that when you have a mindset of an organization, of this is what we're planning to do, that you would be able to do it and you'd be able to attend to it. But at the end of the day, they were human beings. Those human beings have political ideologies. They were terrified of Trump, hated his guts, just like every other mainstream media outlet, and they attuned to the other outlets just because of their dislike and disdain of Trump, meaning their ability to do adversarial journalism was curtailed by their political attunement. And that's unfortunate. And, so it's unfortunate to see him go. By the same token, it's good to see him go, that he had the courage and the ethics, morality to do it. So good for him. Shame on Intercept.
It's true. That's true. All right, next headline here. The United States is hitting a new high in its rate of daily new cases of COVID. That's over 91,000 new cases of COVID-19 in the 24 hours leading up to 8:30 p.m. on Thursday night. Specifically, 91,295 new COVID-19 cases. That is according to Johns Hopkins University. Meanwhile, a county judge in El Paso, Texas, has implemented a 2-week shutdown of all non-essential services beginning at midnight on Thursday night. The decision comes with a surge in COVID cases that's overwhelming local hospitals. Businesses, including tattoo parlors, hair salons, nail salons, gyms, and massage businesses, must close as part of Judge Ricardo Saminiego's order. All election activities are considered essential and will not be impacted by these closures. Today marked the start of a nationwide 4-week government-imposed lockdown in France to fight a resurgent coronavirus wave there. French citizens were confined to their homes as of Friday for the second time in 7 months under a presidential decree ratified by parliament. In Poland, women's rights organizers are preparing for what they say will be the largest protest so far in over a week now of mass nationwide street demonstrations triggered by a court ruling banning abortions of congenitally damaged fetuses. The march is planned for Friday evening. That's tonight, folks, in Warsaw, the capital, in defiance of government appeals that people stay home due to skyrocketing coronavirus infections. The national public prosecutor for the country has vowed to file criminal charges against organizers of the protests for, quote, causing an epidemiological threat, end quote. It's kind of rare sometimes that I struggle with words, but for some reason that one just really threw me for a loop there. A charge that could carry a prison sentence of... What's up, man?
I was just saying you're having a hard time with that one.
That was absolutely. That was a hurdle to get over. A charge that could carry a prison sentence of up to 8 years. Education Minister Przemysław Czarnek, I'm obviously mispronouncing that just very clearly, also threatened to cut off funds to universities that have supported the protest. Some canceled classes during a nationwide strike on Wednesday. Czarnek said that university presidents who encourage their students and academic teachers to take part in the demonstrations contribute to increasing the risk of the coronavirus pandemic. So back and forth on this. It's interesting that the main, at least stated opposition in international news to the protests by the government and various governmental ministers is that it's a public health threat, which, it technically is if you're looking at it. Part of it, though, is if they're all outside, this is the thing. I mean, maybe I'm just looking at it from the United States perspective. BLM protests maybe caused an uptick in cases, but it doesn't seem like the infection rate is nearly as high when you're in an outdoor space as when you're in an indoor space. So even if you have crowds of people congregating, assuming they're wearing masks, even if there's no social distancing, I don't know, man. I can't help but think it would cause an uptick in cases, but it's not going to be as severe as if they're all like filtering into stadiums as they are, for instance, at these Trump rallies.
I agree with you on that one.
Occasionally.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, look, I think it's possible that it causes an uptick at some point. I mean, some random person, just from a probability standpoint, if you guys are together in that way, even with the masks, so fair enough. But yeah, indoors seem to be far worse in regards to the way the virus propagates and the way it's contained within an indoor space. Also, there's some things that go beyond the virus. Like, yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it's important. But the government can't use the virus as a reason to cut down political dissent on an issue that the government put out. Like, if the government says, we're going to start building concentration camps. And people are like, whoa, we don't like that. And the government says, hey, COVID is here, and you can't come out your house because of COVID, and we're going to start locking people up. I mean, that's ludicrous, right? I mean, of course those people are going to protest. They're going to be angry at the fact that you're doing this. And so, I get where the government might be able to make a pitch here, but at the same token, it sounds like they may be using COVID as an excuse to try to shut down dissent. We had to protest here too, and they did the same thing. Made the same excuse. What do you do in this? I mean, if the government does something that's utterly atrocious during a period of a pandemic, what do you do, Shane?
I don't know what you're doing.
Right. It's like, what am I supposed to do with this?
Okay, so you look at it from either perspective. We've got a bunch more headlines, so I really don't want to take too long. But I would probably rule in favor of not prosecuting them. In fact, I would almost certainly do that for a couple of reasons, not least of which because you want people to have more liberty, and you don't want them to feel like you're. In a way, it just breeds more distrust of your responsibility and your authority in the crisis. If people think that you're telling them to stay indoors for political reasons, they're much less likely to listen to you. And so I do worry about using that as a cudgel. But then, of course, there is a threat. So it's a complicated situation. In any event, moving on to future headlines. In an opinion piece, Tucker Carlson has suggested the possibility that a flash drive containing information on Hunter Biden that was given to Fox News by Biden's former business partner, Tony Pavlinsky, was intentionally removed from its packaging and scanned by officials within UPS while it was in transit. The flash drive was, in some sense, removed from its packaging while en route to its destination, and according to UPS, found sitting on the floor before that flash drive was left on a supervisor's desk, where it was unseen for more than 24 hours. Tucker Carlson wrote an opinion piece on this again. He's not saying that UPS did this because who the heck knows, but they've given a kind of dodgy response. And he's reading one possibility into that, as well as others that he briefly goes over in that article. But really, of course, that is the one that he's focusing on is, why did they do this? Was it intentional? Very well could have been. Anyway, more for you to look into if you want to, listeners. In our next headline, Bolivia's outgoing parliament approved a motion recommending that ex-interim president Janine Áñez and her ministers face justice for responsibility over last year's unrest, which left around 30 people dead. The Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, meeting in a joint session, approved on Thursday a parliamentary report on the massacres of Sincada, Sacaba, and Yapacani, which recommends a judgment of responsibility against Janine Áñez for genocide and other offenses. That is according to the Bolivian Senate's Twitter account. In New Zealand, they have voted to legalize euthanasia, but they could be rejecting recreational cannabis, sadly, following two referendums that were part of this month's general election. I just want to be clear. The little interjection thing where I said sadly, that was my opinion. I don't think there's any headline that, like, from a verifiable, reputable news outlet that's really commentating it in that way. But maybe,
right?
The times are changing.
NBC News is going to come out to the Russian government said the euthanasia is sad. They're not even using exactly. Look at this. That's the position of the Russian government. I think they do that. Like if one of us says something about Joe Biden, is that the Russian government is attacking Joe Biden? It's like, no, dude, that's just me. That's just me.
It's true. No, that's the thing. No, that's exactly the thing. In our next headline, Belarus's President Alexander Lukashenko has named a new interior minister and begun partially restricting entries from Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and Ukraine, citing COVID-19 fears. Diplomatic staff are still being allowed through, and trucks can still traverse the borders. A spokeswoman for Poland's border guard told Reuters that Belarus was also still letting in Belarusian nationals. Back in sort of national American news, NBA legend Sean Kemp is opening a pot dispensary in Seattle today. See, we're coming back to that topic, Jamarl. He's becoming one of the few Black-owned cannabis stores in the city. In a press statement, Kemp spoke about his store and how he wants the cannabis industry, which has been mostly dominated by white owners, to, quote, open it up a little bit to everybody, end quote. I can't help but agree with him myself. Kemp, who played for the Seattle Supersonics from 1989 to 1997, is known for his high-flying dunks and for leading his team to the NBA Finals against Michael Jordan. The six-time NBA All-Star now wants to reach new heights in the marijuana retail sector as part owner of Sean Kemp's Cannabis. That has a solid little bit of alliteration at the end. And you know what? That is I'm going to end it on this one because we didn't get to this in the last 2 hours. And I want to get to it now. But it's admittedly an emotional turn. At least 140 migrants have drowned off Senegal in the deadliest shipwreck recorded this year. That's coming according to the United Nations Migration Agency in a statement that they released yesterday. This vessel was carrying about 200 people, according to that statement. It added that, quote, according to media sources, the Senegalese and Spanish navies and fishermen who were nearby rescued 59 people and retrieved the remains of 20 others, end quote. The boat was bound for Spain's Canary Islands, but caught fire a few hours after departing a coastal town in western Senegal before it capsized near St. Louis on the country's northwest coast. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we're going into a break here, and we'll be back on the other side. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also, excuse me, in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, definitely give us a like and definitely share that material. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with the chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. But now, coming to the channel, we have Yvette Carnell, activist and research analyst whose work is focused on politics, wealth, and race. She is widely recognized as co-founder of ADOS, an advocacy movement focused on promoting a political agenda specific to American descendants of slavery. Yvette, welcome to the show.
Hey, how you doing?
I am doing okay. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, I appreciate you having me.
So we had someone on the show the other day who invoked ADOS. And let's say it wasn't necessarily in a favorable light. And so I definitely wanted you to come on because I wanted you to have a chance to basically talk about what ADOS is, what it's pushing for, what it represents, and even why there's some controversy around it. So let's start off at the beginning. What is ADOS? What is the organization and why did you start it or help start it?
Well, ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery, is a movement that speaks specifically to the needs of ADOS, because what we find is that ADOS is a bottom caste, even separated outside of blackness. So we're not just black people. We are black people who have descended from slavery, and that has a specific cost because you have an accrued disadvantage as you come all the way to Reconstruction, to the Black Code, as you come to Jim Crow, as you come to mass incarceration. So I can draw a line from there to here. So what we say is, listen, we have ADOS, we have a reparations is the fix. So reparations is the heartbeat of our movement. We also have a black agenda, but reparations is the only thing that fixed that cost and accrued disadvantage from those 400 years to now. So that's who we are, and that's what the movement is.
I was looking over the website, and there's aspects of this that are flat fact true, because I agree with you. From the standpoint of African Americans, there's a debt that's owed. I mean, ultimately, you had labor, African Americans, the black body being used as a commodity, and some, or the country itself, who put in laws, were able to make tons of cash off of that body. And then at a certain point, not even given a mule. And then the wild part about this conversation is that over the course of time, it would get to a point where they said, okay, well, yeah, that stuff is in the past. As if somehow the past is untethered to itself. So what do you use as an argument for people who say, well, I wasn't living back then. I wasn't born during that time. And kind of like they used to throw at James Baldwin, black folks need to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. How do you try to articulate to those people that, the things that happen in time or in history, there's no untethering. It sticks, and you can draw a straight line to it. Like, for example, 122,366. That is, the wealth of the median household wealth of whites. African Americans, 1,233. That's astonishing. How do you explain to people who are against reparations, be it black, white, or anywhere between, that this is something that's necessary and vital in order to, let's say, mind the gap that was created from something that happened centuries ago?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is help them to understand cost, right? So, they have to understand, you may not have done anything, but the bricks of your home are built from that slavery and that cost and what you had the opportunity to have and what we were shut out of, right? And so some people view cost as kind of static. So this is the cost of 1619, and this is the cost of 1776, and this is the cost of 1850 or whatever. That's not the way cost works. Just like the wealth of the people who were able to access money and access capital during that time, that's not us. We were slaves, and then we were bottom casted and Jim Crow. Even before that, right after Reconstruction. So what you have to understand is that just like that money, that capital, that wealth is still in our economy, that poverty is still in our economy. And one group gets to, or a couple of groups maybe get to pass down that wealth. And there are other groups, this is us, that got passed down the poverty over and over and over again. And so the only way you right that wrong is to do reparations, because you can't go back. Because what I tell people all the time is you can't go back, because the problem with going back is America was growing at a specific rate at a specific time. America was growing. And when you're growing that big, that's the moment where you make billionaires, you make millionaires, and they can pass their career down to their kids. We got taken off the board, so we didn't even get the opportunity to become what they became in terms of Rockefellers and everything like that. In terms of even Steve Jobs, in terms of even Microsoft, we were off the board. We were not available to make any of those companies. And now America is a country that has everything it needs. Well, you can't really. A lot of people try to say, well, I'm going to recreate myself now. No, the timing is wrong. You needed to do it then and have it passed down. You needed to be able to have that and be the person that had the kid who would do X, Y, Z. And we weren't able to do that because we couldn't even protect our own intellectual property. So you see even chefs and people who came up with recipes for liquor and all kinds of stuff just had that snatched away because we couldn't protect ourselves. The only way you do that now is you just have to have a redistribution of wealth from them to us as a specific group. It's not complicated, but that's why reparations is the only solution for that.
What do you mean by reparations? Because, they always act like this is complicated. Like when Biden is like, I'm going to have a commission to study this. Everybody wants a commission. And, it's because I think I agree with the fundamental argument. I mean, I don't know how anybody could disagree with the fundamental argument, right? Unless you just kind of make the point of saying, yeah, we're past it, et cetera. But you can look at the stats and you can look at the data and you could see the disparities that have taken place over the course of years, even from parents who, have kids who are in poverty have a higher chance of those kids being in poverty. That's known. Low, brain matter, that type of stuff. Like all of those things are affected being in impoverished conditions. The water, like the lead water that the kids were drinking. Poverty has a cost. And I think the point that you're making is this isn't something that magically happened. This is something that was instantiated just from the origins of the country and the way the country propagated from then to now. I was looking at some of the stats. I knew some of these, but some of these are astonishing. Median household net worth by race. Post-college, $455,000 for whites, $141,000 for blacks with college, 268,000 for whites, 70,000 for blacks. Some college, 135,000 for whites, 18,000 for blacks. Like, these numbers get astonishing at a certain point. So how do you fix this? Like, from the standpoint, if you had somebody who was, let's say Trump got in office, Trump says, I want to get elected, I want to get the black vote, I'm going to push through reparations. What do you tell him to try to fix this very specific gap? I mean, because this goes beyond just putting money in people's pocket. This is wealth. It's a little different.
Well, I think the first thing I tell Trump or Biden, anybody else, if they want to do reparations, is this. Like, this is, the number is at least 17 trillion. That's what we know, right? And I would tell them what doesn't get talked about a lot and should be get talked. I mean, let me just say this: academics have failed in this arena to a large extent because it's not just about the number. We focus a lot on the number, but we also have to have protection, so that like you are penalized for like targeting this community of people and for preying on us in a certain way. So like what happened to us during the housing crisis, you can't have that anymore. It's not a slap on the wrist anymore. Oh, they targeted black people, wouldn't give them loans, and they had the same credit scores as everybody else. But they said, no. You need to go to jail. There have to be laws on the books to where if you target us, you get held accountable in the worst of ways. So there has to be a series of laws that goes along with reparations, because if not, you're just a consumer. See, the thing people don't understand when we talk about a check, if there are not laws on the books that protect you, people will prey on you. White capital will prey on you, and you're just a consumer. So they're going to come to you and say, you know what? There's nothing for you to really do with that money. We're going to present a bunch of scams or stock options or whatever, and have you invest in those, and you're going to lose that money and send the money right back to us. So there has to be something that allows us to not only protect us, but to plug into the ownership class, because that's what we have to do. We have to be members of the ownership class. And so America has to figure out a way. Listen, y'all had a bunch of land that went up for sale, and now we need it. We were supposed to buy it a long time ago. We tried to buy it, and it was stolen from us. So there has to be some type of redistribution mechanism. The other thing I would also say is there can't be a time limit. You know, I saw in one proposal that the time limit to distribute funds was 10 years. I don't think you put any kind of time limit in. Because one of the things that you find, you have to look just now, the Jewish community is still getting reparations from the Holocaust. It's 2020. So what you find is that you have to fill that group with resources and money until that, what I would call a lineage wealth gap, is equal. You have to do that. It doesn't matter how long, because it takes only a small amount of time to kind of inflict a wound. It takes a much longer time to heal a wound. So you have to heal that wound until that wound is healed. There is no time limit on that. This may take more than one generation, because it took you more than one generation to oppress us. So it may take you more than that to fix us.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, what does that mean, though? Like, what does that look like? Because I agree with you about the reparations thing. I agree with you that a debt is owed. I agree with you that the wound took centuries to create and that wealth was generated, ownership and everything else. But what's the material answer is what I'm asking. Because I agree with you. It goes beyond, you can give somebody a check each month, but that check can get frittered away, because your point is that the ownership and everything else that was established in the United States happened from what took place centuries ago, because it built over time. You had one family giving money to another. You had another family that was well developed. That kid had all the capabilities in the world. That kid went to school. He did extremely well for himself, but it started with the origins of his family. That's kind of what I'm getting at. And those families were broken up. What I'm asking you is, how do you plug in a group to the ownership class after hundreds of years of forward progression? How do you do it? And I guess that's what I'm asking you. Do you have a plan for that? If indeed you could articulate it to somebody, get them to pick it up.
Well, there is a plan, but the problem is that plan includes a lot, right? That plan not only includes policy and payments, that plan includes what I call lineage therapy as well, right? Because there's a lot that has happened to us. I was talking yesterday to somebody who said that, when things happen in my family, people don't really talk about it. Well, we have to talk about it, because we have to get beyond it. And the only way to get beyond it is to have that kind of lineage therapy kind of inside of that. Right. We should have a sort of in terms of how we do things. I think there should be some space for some type of for some type of mentorship inside of that. There's a lot that's going to happen inside of a reparations bill that people aren't even talking about, but it's necessary. Because you have a group that's come outside of trauma, and a traumatized group behaves a certain way. Sometimes that's not even in their best interest. So there has to be some kind of therapy to uproot why we're behaving a certain way, why we're doing a certain thing in a way that's not pathologized.
Well, that's what I was going to get at. Well, let's talk about that in the next break, because it does. Let's talk about that, because that gets a little. That gets into the psychology of individuals, and people are going to have some kind of feelings if you're trying to tell them that there's something wrong with them, even if there's something wrong with them. But let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The voice you're listening to is Yvette Carnell, activist and research analyst whose work is focused on politics, wealth, and race. She is widely recognized as co-founder of ADOS, an advocacy movement focused on promoting a political agenda specific to the American descendants of slavery. We'll be right back in a moment. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guest for this segment, Yvette Carnell. She's an activist and research analyst whose work is focused on politics, wealth, and race. She is widely recognized as a co-founder of ADOS or ADOS, an advocacy movement focused on promoting a political agenda specific to American descendants of slavery. And while we've got her on, I wanna share her stuff. You can find Yvette on her YouTube channel, Facebook, and Instagram at ycarnell. That is Carnell with 2 L's at the end. You can also find her on Twitter at Breaking Brown and on her website, breakingbrown.com. And Annette, in the last segment, Jamarl was referencing some statistics on the website about ADOS. That is, by the way, ADOS 101.com. Annette, thank you again for being with us. Interesting conversation. We've been talking about this occasionally on the show, and yeah, especially after we had the guest that Jamarl was hinting at on. I kind of wanted to bring you on to have this conversation too. Fascinating stuff. A bunch of different things we could go into here. But I think I'll start right here, and I'll sort of give you a two-ended question that sort of gets into the same material here. Back during the primaries, a number of candidates ran in the Democratic Party. One of those was Marianne Williamson, and she was pretty notable at the time for bringing up the topic of reparations. I'm curious, first of all, what did you think of that? As a sort of was that representative or emblematic of anything for you? But also, more broadly, what do you think the left gets wrong about ADOS? Yvette, thanks again for being with us. What's your take?
Appreciate you. And not just Marianne Williamson wasn't just a person who brought reparations to the stage. She had actually, met with and spoke with Antonio Moore, who was my co-founder of ADOS, about, reparations. So, very early on. So we kind of appreciated her in that way in terms of being accessible and allowing herself to be influenced. She didn't get the number right, but she kept reparations for ADOS on the table and in the debate in a way that helped us to normalize reparations as part of the conversation. So we absolutely appreciate Marianne Williamson for that. No doubt about it. Absolutely no doubt about it.
what do people get wrong about the organization? Because the gentleman who was on, and this is just to back up Shane's question, what's the, like, when people disagree with ADOS, what is the thing that they're typically disagreeing with? What's well, let's say either miscommunication, or what do they get right and they just fundamentally disagree with you guys with?
Well, the thing that they get wrong all the time is this idea that we're divisive. We get a bad rap because people say, "Oh my God, you mean reparations isn't for every black person? You're divisive," and we have to explain to them, no. We're not opposed to allies, but you don't get reparations. You cannot have just got here, whether it was in 1954. Or most Africans came here after 1990. You can't have this because this is designed for a specific group who built a specific thing and got oppressed because of it. We built the country free labor and got oppressed ever since then. And I can. There's a tie that binds. I can draw a straight line. So when I say, hey, we got a whole black agenda that includes you, but the reparations piece does not include you, people say, oh, you're divisive and you must hate black immigrants, not understanding that, no, this is tied to a specific group because a specific group did a specific thing and paid a very specific cost. And so you don't get to shoehorn in on that cost because you have melanin. That's the thing that gets people upset. But that's the thing that we're not backing down on either. It's just the reality of life. It's what happened.
If you got here in the 80s,
interesting conversation.
You shouldn't get reparations. I mean, you know what I mean? I don't see anything wrong with that. I mean, I guess I think the issue is I think sometimes the language may get strong in making a distinction between the people who should get reparations versus not. Is that fair? I mean, because it seems that there's some who have some strong feelings against the organization. And you would think that to some degree they would agree with the tenets. Like, because I agree with you that I think it's weird that if you got here in 1960 that you expect to get reparations. I think that's bizarre. And the last thing that we did, I think it was affirmative action, white women ended up being the majority, getting the majority of the jobs out of that. So understand the argument of, look, it needs to be specific and it needs to be targeted. How do you do the targeting? And I think that's the problem. And not just the problem, even trying to make that work. Like, do you think there will be political consequences for putting something like that through? And this is kind of where I broke away from it in a political sense. Meaning, I agree with it in principle. I agree with it even in policy from the standpoint, especially now after the Black Lives Matter movement and everything else. But my problem was I couldn't see how to articulate it in politics. Because at the time, I think when Sanders was running, I think it was like the majority of the population was against it. After the Black Lives Matter stuff, that seemed to flip to some degree. How do you convince the public, especially Black Lives Matter, especially because when they were marching and all of the rallies and stuff was taking place, I thought it was too diminutive. I thought that the crux of the issue that they were really trying to hit at is poverty. And I strongly suspect that a program like this would have been far better of something to push for as a larger solution, as opposed to this very specific item of defunding the police. Does that make sense? Like, it just seems like the issue is poverty. I mean, even if you look at Jacob Blake, you look at Wisconsin, I mean, the majority of the areas in Wisconsin were like prisons or something. I mean, it's astonishing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, no, I think that is, there was a great study from a few years ago to show that black poverty isn't even white poverty. So that white poverty and black poverty are not the same. So I do think you have to convince people, like, listen, the problem that we have is that America has developed a caste system. And in doing so, we are the bottom caste of that system. And the question is, how do we get out of that caste status? And the only way you get out of that caste status is through reparations. There's no other way for you to break caste. It won't happen. And I think that's the thing that people have to understand as they go forward and as they think about this thing. They have to understand that there's no other way to break caste other than reparations. We thought about it for a very long time and thought, is there another solution? And what we figured out is no, class doesn't fix race. People have all kind of class solutions, and that's fine. Class is about uplifting people, the quality of life in general. But that doesn't that doesn't fix a very specific group who was harmed a very specific way. And so that's what we found. And that's what we're trying to tell people. Listen, class doesn't fix race. We wish it did, but it doesn't. And so you have to get serious about what has to happen to ADOS in terms for us to flourish. And you have to have redistribution. You have to have policies in place that protect us. And you have to have things in place that integrate us into the economy, into banking, that were never in place before.
I guess my feeling is I don't know how to do that.
Speaking.
I mean, and maybe it's not for me to do. I'm sorry. Go.
Well, let me just say this. The reason we don't know how to do that is because none of these academics have actually talked about. I thought about writing my own book because nobody has talked about what it actually means.
Yeah, what it means.
It's an enormous undertaking because even if you write policy, right, we're not just talking about writing a reparations bill to get a check. Once you write the inclusion piece of the policy, that's enormous because that forces people to kind of integrate you into the economy and into land ownership and all sorts of things in ways that they did not want to do. That forces policies to protect you in a way that policies have never protected ADOS in this country. There's a lot to write into a reparations bill that has never been written into a reparations bill. And that's part of the reason I think you may be having trouble envisioning it because nobody's ever put the work in to give you that at least that template, for lack of a better word.
That's fair.
How it's supposed to happen. But you have to have protections and you have to have
it is unprecedented.
Yeah, it's an enormous undertaking.
I mean, I'm glad you brought up towards the end there the land specifically. I mean, Jamarl brought it up in last segment too with the mule comment, obviously 40 acres and a mule there, a reference to the amount of land and the property guaranteed to descendants of black slaves following the Civil War. It didn't happen, of course. I mean, I think that's an example of the kind of fixed wealth that, that breaks that generational cycle. That wouldn't be the only plank of something like this, but I think that something like that should be a core component of it. And you can look at this, I'm not black. You can look at this just as an American. You can look at this as somebody who, like, looking back to the foundations of our country, this is one of those, like, deep, irrevocable sins that just from a sort of nation building, from a political science lens, if you're trying to mend your country and come to some whole and some stability, you need to work through that. You can't have this constant cycle of oppression and, of what that means, what that does to the culture and to the body politic for everybody, frankly. You need to be able to break that cycle. So it's unprecedented, but it's worth undertaking. One thing I wanted to bring up, we've only got a couple minutes left with you. Hope we can get you back on at some point. One thing I wanted to bring up, specifically during the 50s, during the 60s, in the civil rights era and in the wake of it, in the coming decades, it seemed like there was an opportunity, if not for reparations, at least for something approaching it in the form of like a solid economic basis for Black Americans. And then that was shattered. And what you moved into was this mixed weird system, the sort of worst of both worlds, in my opinion, where like welfare life support without the possibility of any real long-term economic foundation of self-support and stability. And part of that happened through outsourcing. There are different components of this. Part of it happened with the gutting of American manufacturing. You lost a lot of like stable jobs there in largely Black cities that would have gone to building up like stable Black families and communities. And that stuff got eradicated. In our last minute or two with you, Yvette, just on that era, am I onto anything there? What's your beliefs about that?
I think a lot of stuff did get eradicated. I think the whole point was to kind of warehouse us in, redlining was just a plan really to warehouse us in the ghettos, right? And so I think welfare too was a kind of a plan of just like, okay, we're going to give something here. We're going to give them this and they're going to be over here away from us. And I think people who want to see true Americanism, if you want to see, I have a lot of people who said, even in terms of reparations, oh my gosh, y'all want reparations and you want to be a part of this country. Well, yeah, we built it. We're Americans. We go back many, many generations. Yes, we absolutely do. But I think the way that you own like that, you have to have a plan in place where we have something, like you just said, ownership, where we have a piece of the American pie that is not just tied to some type of welfare or something like that. We have a piece of the American pie that is tied to really what we gave this country, really what we contributed to this country. Like it has to be kind of reflect who we are and what our contribution is, which means we have to be elevated. And there are certainly processes for that. The problem that we run up against, and the problem in terms of what I'm trying to do and what I'm writing, is that I have to reinvent the wheel, because there are groups and organizations and bills and stuff that fall far short of really going to what has to happen. This is not a simple thing that has to. This will be the heaviest lift that America's ever lifted, because we're the most oppressed that you've ever oppressed. And the language of the bills that are going to come forth, and I believe they're coming, have to reflect that. They can't be simpleton. So and that's why I said I was thinking about writing my own book, because you have to explain everything from ownership of land to policy protection to how we're going to be integrated into these new wealth groups. That has to all be laid out, and it hasn't been laid out. And I think the fact that it hasn't been laid out is why some people get confused.
You should write that book.
But you know what, Yvette?
You should write that book, honestly.
You should. Yeah, you should. You should. We've got to close out. Yvette, thank you so much for joining us. We're out of time, but I really appreciate you joining us.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and hopefully we can get you back on. For those listening, that was Yvette Carnell, activist and research analyst whose work is focused on politics, wealth, and race. She is widely recognized as a co-founder of ADOS, an advocacy movement focusing on promoting a political agenda specific to American descendants of slavery. You can find Yvette on her YouTube channel, Facebook, and Instagram at ycarnell, that's CARNELL, on Twitter at Breaking Brown, and on her website, breakingbrown.com. And again, to throw this website out there, if you want to learn more about ADOS and see the statistics that Jamarl was referencing last segment for yourself, you can at ADOS101.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking calls 202-521-1320, and we will be back on the other side of this break in 1 minute.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
We increase activities in the Kemp airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Our phone number, and we're taking calls. Forward that phone number. The phone number is 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320 is the number. We've got Brave on the line calling in from Atlanta, but again, we're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Brave, what's on your mind? What's going on, man?
Hey, good morning, guys. I am so happy. I was so happy to hear you guys had Yvette on the show, and I was really just extremely overjoyed to hear her speak on the show and actually speak to the issues, not the issues with ADOS, but speak about ADOS and clarify it for a lot of people. The guests you guys had on that particular show, where most of us, myself, and a few other guests, a few other calls called in, erupting. I think it was Jared Ball. That guy. I enjoy him when he's on shows, but he does have a history of going around and speaking negatively of ADOS. And I don't want to crap on him because he's not here to defend himself. But I think there's something deeper there because there are a number of brown faces that make it a point of crapping on ADOS whenever they have a chance to be on platforms.
Let me ask you this. Why? Why do you think that? I mean, why do you think they do that? I mean, because she was on the show. She was able to make her point in her position. And I don't know the entirety of her work. So I don't know, the everything that's said. And I'm pretty sure that if you pulled even some of my videos, it'd be like, oh, wow, that was rough. That was a hard day, something like that. And so I imagine outskirts, but her argument seems on point to me. Meaning it's like, look, there are people in this country who descended from slaves, and the conditions, meaning from generation to generation to generation that those people came from, there's a special, let's say, there's a certain section, there's a certain trauma that's associated with that group. And it's like, generational. And so it makes sense to me that if somebody got here in the 50s, they don't get the reparations, whatever that means, going forward. I get that. And I even get that it's more than a check. Because to me, it was like, if it's a check, it's a little weird. Also, my issue has to do with, more than anything else, the backlash. If you have the majority of the population in this country that's poor are white, meaning the majority of the people on welfare are white. What happens? Shane, both of you, if reparations passes and African Americans start getting checks, they start getting land, they start getting, let's say, benefits for, let's say, certain businesses, let's say like the marijuana businesses and those type of things in order to kind of give legs up, what does the other population do? Shane.
Well, I can come in on that, but I can come in on that, but Brave, go for it. Yeah, I heard you talking.
Let me say this real quick. First and foremost, in order for something, let me answer this in order. The idea that we have to ask the question, why is it such a pushback when it feels like it would be common sense, tells you, kind of answers it. The idea that you have to point out that these people that have been through all of this deserve this to some extent, whereas you have all these other nationalities and ethnic groups that have received reparations, as Yvette pointed out, tells you that there is a bias against that group. It's just plain out there. To rest of your question, in order to even begin to put something like this in place, would call for an entirely different leadership than we have in place currently. And I would think that one could argue that having that type of leadership would be capable of addressing reparations and carrying it out would also introduce aid and assistance to this issue we have with class, especially the working class and the impoverished and homeless. You see what I'm saying? So it's the idea of a rising tide lifts all boats, but from the ground.
That's 100% the thing. That's 100% the thing. Yeah, I mean, I just want to jump in that. That's pretty much what I was saying. If you're doing that, you're probably the person who's doing this is probably not going to be their one position issue because frankly, they wouldn't get elected on that. You wouldn't have a mass constituency. But if this became part of a party platform, if this became a platform of a presidential candidate, and that's probably what it would be. It would be a pretty exciting moment. It would be coming amidst a bunch of other stuff, becoming as part of a raft. And like he's saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. If you're not stuck in a sort of fixed pie mindset where it's whatever good is coming to this person is to the detriment of me, and and mine or whatever, then that I think that fades away. There is an argument that whites have an entrenched interest in the economic system because we're disproportionately represented in it. But I want to jump in on that other thing too. I think that a rising tide lifts all boats. And frankly, again, speaking broadly as an American, attempting to at least, this is it's just one of those foundational problems that we've got to freaking solve to save our country and to get back to an optimistic future, or maybe to get forward to an optimistic future for the first time.
Agreed. Because it needs to end. Because that needs to end. I mean, it's almost like a scar that's just there. And the public at some point in the 60s, it looks like it used to be argued and debated. I mean, if you go back and look at some of the arguments these guys used to have, it was astonishing the stuff they used to say to each other. It was open and present. And it's like you have this scar and nobody wants to do anything about it. And it's like, okay, well, let's just pretend it doesn't exist. Or let's just move past it. Or let's just get beyond it. And it's like, well, you can't get beyond it because you can look at this kind of exponential reality that people are living through. And it wasn't, just magic. It was one generation after the next, after the next, after the next. That was basically the extension of the previous generation. And you had some people who were able to exceed, but many weren't. So I agree with both of you. My fear in this, if I have any fear at all, and I agree with you, it will probably be part of a platform, but it will be a massive undertaking. And it will be a different consciousness of the nation to make that even work.
I think we're living in a time that it gives us some demands. It offers us demands in terms of what we have to stand up to and who the people that we have to become and the kinds of leaders we have to elect. And on a deep level, we hold within us the capacity to do that kind of thing. We've got other callers, and so I kind of want to
one caveat. But, also, anti-poverty program. You have to do both. I'm telling you, you're going to create friction in the society if you end up with, okay, we're going to elevate one system and let the other. You have to get rid of poverty for everybody while doing the reparations thing.
Well, here's the thing. We got two other callers. If I'm going to try to keep this like 15 seconds.
Go ahead.
Anti-poverty, yes. The other side of this is you got to have some positive future, some positive vision of society that you're working towards.
Yes.
So that's not jobs, because jobs is a little bit too ambiguous. That's like specifically what kind of economy, what kind of society you want to have, what level of community engagement, how much strength you want people to have, and what that strength is practically going to look like in terms of civic participation and ownership, those kinds of things. There's some positive visions, and I guess I just want to say I think it's beneficial to focus on those.
But
poverty
that's
is
a society with a point of view.
Clear out, but that's a negative. Yeah,
but that's an awesome
in other words,
thing, though.
You can be anti-poverty, but all you're trying to do is reduce some negative thing. You also need to have some positive good that you're pursuing, and that really is leadership. That's where that comes in. But straight up, we've got two other callers.
I do agree with you. I guess I'm saying having a society that it's pivoted towards something is great. I'm just saying your society also has the capacity to say we're going to eliminate this, just like China's doing. I think we should do it.
Yeah.
But go ahead. But I agree with you on the
Roe in California. Stuff. For sure. No, fascinating conversations. Wish we always had more time. Roe in California, you're on the line. What's going on, man?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hello?
And pardon me for misgendering you. How's it going, Roe?
Okay, thanks for taking my call. So one thing I want to say is that, really Jared Ball's criticism of ADOS is the nativism behind it, right? And I think that is really problematic for ADOS. For one, in order to get the kind of reparations that they're talking about, you need to have the U.S. state in order to do that, right? So in that sense, it perpetuates the need for the U.S. state. Two, it reinforces economic and cultural aspects of the United States, which I think are fundamentally at their core flawed. And as you guys say often, the U.S. is a failed state. And so ADOS requires that failed state remains in place.
Yeah, but the United States is in place. I mean, It may be a quote-unquote failed state, but let's just be clear. It's still a state. It's still in existence. People are still getting their Social Security checks. I mean, I don't understand this particular criticism.
Well, my criticism is that what is ADOS looking for? Is ADOS looking for freedom, or is ADOS looking for equality with a failed state?
Well, ADOS is looking for reparations. I mean, it's not these grand themes. That's all I'm saying. Oh, go ahead, Shane. I'm sorry.
I guess it sounds like we've got one more. We've also got one more caller that we should go to. Thank you for the call, Ro. Malik, calling in from D.C. Got about 20, 30 seconds. What's on your mind, man?
Hey, fellas. I always end up as the last call, man. Listen, you guys have got to get a representative from the African People's Socialist Party on the air. The African People's Socialist Party deals with reparations. They have a white supporter organization the African People's Solidarity Committee. It is an organization of white people that organize reparations in America. These are
producers, Malik. We are sadly out of time, but Malik, I swear, our producers hear you, and they will reach out because that sounds interesting. But we're out of time. Thank you for the call, Malik. We're done this week. We're going to be back on Monday. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Thank you to Engineer Andre. Thank you to our producers. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas, my co-host, and thank you for listening. Back on Monday, again, signing off. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Have a great weekend, folks.
Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. Another good show. That was a damn good show. I am so glad Yvette came onto the show. Our producer was pointing her out. And I was like, okay, well, let's, we'll bring her on. We'll check her out. And I had seen her once or twice before, but I hadn't heard too much about her. And there were people on the channel who would bring her ADOS up every so often. And you would get, I don't know. I mean, people felt some kind of way about it both ways. And so it's hard to get a point of view. And so I wanted to bring her on, talk to her. And, I don't necessarily know everything that she has ever said, but I agree with what she said on the show. And so I can't necessarily entirely fault her. But I'm pretty sure talk to anybody long enough, you'll find some level of a disagreement. But no, this is a damn good show today, guys. Look, as always, I appreciate you guys for joining us. I appreciate you guys for watching. Yeah, I ended here. You will see this mug throughout the course of the day. So I'm just going to say like, share, and subscribe. Thanks, everyone. Oh, wait, first, let's make sure we didn't miss anything. Megan Morales, make reparations a verb, not simply a noun or congressional act. With the Green New Deal, FJG, it must be ongoing if we have any hope for a stable country again. Yes, Megan. I agree. I mean, look, something happened that was never reconciled. And it is impossible to go back in time to fix that thing. But what you can do is try to mine the gap that comes now. Two problems. If you have a reparations program exclusive to American descendants of slaves, which is probably what I would agree with, your country is still ensconced in whites that are poor. And if you thought Trump got into office, meaning the backlash to the reparations or the backlash to Reconstruction would also, I strongly suspect, happen again to some degree, unless the country was in a different cultural space mentally, or at the exact same time that the reparations is pushed through, an anti-poverty program is pushed through in order to eliminate poverty in regards to whites and everyone else. Shane adds a good point to that. Having a point. Like, if your society is saying, look, we're going to build a Hyperloop, and we're going to build it from California to New York, and we're going to make it so people can get in, and within 30 minutes, they're across the world. We're going to build a base on the moon. Why? Just for shits and giggles. We're going to fix our infrastructure. We're going to have maglevs that goes from this point to that point. Why? Just because. There's no point to existence. And if there's no point to existence, anything that you do for the most part is what you do. I guess I'm making a very specific point that from the standpoint of a government or a city or state, especially if that government wants to accrue revenue, that government makes dollars. That government can spend those dollars. And it can spend those dollars on things that require people to work. And in spending dollars on things that require people to work, they may be build bridges or fixing up waterways, or, again, building things that are new and interesting. And in doing so, putting people to work. It's a society with a point. Meaning, whatever that program is, that program would have to be overwhelming, overarching. And it would have to be something that the person can basically explain and say, this is what we're going to do. This is the point. And within the context of that, the other things fall in line. Because I agree. When Kennedy was doing the moon thing, imagine what that was like. Look, you're a kid and you're seeing these guys building a spaceship. Or you're a child and you're hearing the president say, we're going to the moon. And he's like screaming and flinging his fists and shit. Imagine that. And you're growing up in that. And you're reading comic books about people going into space. And you're seeing astronauts walking on the moon. They knew dick about building a spaceship at that point. And yet, there they were. Imagine what that's like. Your society is building something that is going to leave the planet. And you, as a person, as a child, realize I can be a part of that. I can be a part of what my country is doing in this situation. I can be a part in this kind of collective action that's doing something that's grand and that's awesome and that's going to be the benefit to the whole. There's something about that that goes beyond just having a job, that goes into this person feeling part of a collective whole. And that's something we should strive for. We should get towards. We don't do that. We don't do that. We choose not to do that. Love some Steve Grumbine. Thanks. Bad Mama Jam. Steve Grumbine is good. Bad Mama Jam. He's awesome. Thanks again for having Steve on. Really appreciate Real Progressives crew are doing. Glad y'all are doing, collaborating. Much love. Yeah, John Steiner. Steve has been on a few times. Steve is always a great guest. He used to come on my regular show. I think it's funny. I guess I stopped having guests on my regular show when I started having guests on this show because we have them all the time. But yeah, he's awesome. He knows his stuff. Bright, earnest. When he first came on, notice he was talking about the election and so how, I have trepidation about this, etc. He's honest. He's a good guy. William De Silva. Thank you, William De Silva. And I think that's it. All right, guys, I want to thank all of you. I need to go chat with my team. But, by the way, we're going to be doing election night coverage. That thing is going to be like all night. So on Tuesday at 8 o'clock, I'm going to start off on phone lines. And we'll be basically rotating all night the entire time. I'm going to be at the studio doing it. I don't know if I'm going to be there all night. Maybe. I'll see. They're supposed to be changing people out. But indefatigable as I am, I may try to see if I can just hang out and stay. We'll see. Depends on powers. If my powers start waning, I'm going to take my ass home. All right. I'm going to leave this here. I'm going to say like, share, subscribe. You guys will see me probably in less than an hour. Thanks all.